Welcome everybody to our all-day meeting today. Today is Friday, September 29th. It's 8:34 a.m. We are convened as the Provo City School District Board of Education. We're meeting at 280 West, 940 North in Provo, and we are going to begin with a roll call. And we'll start with Melanie.
Melanie Hall, board member.
Oh, Meg Van Wagenen, board member.
Gina Hales, board member.
Oh, I'm sorry, Rochelle. Go ahead.
Wendy Dow, superintendent.
Rebecca Nielsen, board president.
Jennifer Partridge, vice president.
Terry McCabe, board member.
Lisa Boyce, board member.
Derek Anderson, business administrator.
Okay, and then we also have cabinet members with us today, and hopefully lots of interested citizens watching online. So, welcome everybody. Is there a motion to begin our study session today?
I move that we begin our study session.
Great. Motion made by board member Van Wagenen. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by board member Boyce. We are now in our study session. All right, my computer just shut off, and I don't have my agenda in front of me except for paper, so let me see here. Okay, we are going to start today with a board handbook training, and we're going to give that time to our Vice President, Jennifer Partridge.
All right, thank you. For the training today, I wanted to reference the school board professional governance standards that we've been given from the Utah School Board Association. And on the inside, there's 6 qualities of effective board members, and today I wanted to go over the one called collaborative. And so the points under being collaborative is to develop a cohesive board team, seek for understanding, problem solve within proper roles, support board decisions, and avoid promoting a personal agenda. And I was thinking about what that means to develop a cohesive board team, and it made me think of one of the classes I went to at the Leadership Academy recently, where she talked about some different principles that could go with that. And so 2 things I wanted to share. First of all, she shared a quote by Stephen Covey Jr., and he says, "You could have 2 trustworthy people working together and no trust between them if neither person is willing to extend trust to the other." And so I think that's one of the tenets of having an effective team, is that we trust one another so that we can work well together. And then another thing that I really liked from that is in the class she talked about seeing the strengths in one another and intentionally connecting your work as a board with the talents and skills of your colleagues. And so recognizing that we all have different strengths, and as a team, we can all lift our own part and work together on that. And I think that goes both ways. Like sometimes we have to recognize that in one another so we can let go and give that to other people. But I think sometimes I myself feel like I need to do it all, like I'm falling short if I'm not involved in every single thing. And I recognize we're all very hard workers. I feel overall our teamwork is going really well, and I think this also gives us permission to recognize that different people serving in different committees and things like that, that's great. Let everyone have their strengths, and then we're a better team because of that, and you don't have to carry the load all by yourself. So any feedback or thoughts about any of these points of being collaborative? Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jennifer. We'll go ahead and move on to our second item of the day, the accountability updates, and we're going to give that over to our superintendent and teaching and learning department.
Yeah, can I use a regular mic?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm hoping it, Bonnie, do you want to, well, you know what, I can just take over the screen. Is that okay? I'll just do that. There should be linked a presentation called Accountability Report and Updates. All right, Bonnie, you're gonna have to project it, because I don't know what's going on. My computer is not happy today. I can't, because I'm just gonna have to turn off my computer. My mouse won't work. Okay. It's just not happy today. What? What did you? I know. I don't know what's going on. It wasn't working this morning either.
We want to recognize Student Board Representative William Widener just entered.
Sorry, you can take a break for a minute if you want.
Be a dance.
We could have a dance party. We could do that.
I would always do that.
Will you make it bigger, Bonnie? Oh, you can't? Oh, see, I see what's happening. Okay, hold on. Okay, we're good? All right, let me pull up mine. Okay, thank you for your patience. So, we thought it might be helpful, and I really want to give a big shout out to Michelle Eldridge. She helped me put this together and make sure that our information was accurate. The state has just updated accountability, and when we talk about accountability, it means basically how our schools and our district are being reported on, if you will. So it's going to be like when you see the school report card, what are all of the different pieces that are falling into that? And they have made some changes, and some of them are actually very good. They have been complaints that we have been making to the state office for quite some time, and they've actually been negotiating with the federal government for quite a while to get those things changed. And so these things were just updated. Like this manual was just updated, I think like a few days ago. It just showed up on our on the state's website. So I don't know like how much you're aware of our accountability and what happens with it, but it will become really clear why people get really frustrated with it, because it's really hard to understand where to put your resources because of how complex the formulas are. And so it's like, well, what do I actually do to make this number better? And so that's really where I'd like to kind of center our conversation today and talk a little bit about some thoughts that we're discussing as an MTSS and cabinet as to what our next steps are, and how that might also generate some discussions about FTE allocation and why we probably need to rethink some of the formulas and things that we're using. So if you want to scroll down, Bonnie. So our accountability system evaluates our schools and our district. It is to be noted that Provo City School District is in a district in improvement, and you will see this, like we have several schools where we are struggling, and if I say something wrong, Michelle, you just pipe in and be like, no. And so it really takes it, yeah, you have to do it loud like that, really obnoxious, or come over and pull my hair or something, whatever it takes. It's going to take into account proficiency measures, which is what we refer to as academic or achievement, student growth, and then there's also formulas that are built in to calculate equity and to see how equitable your resources are being allocated. It is required by ESSA, which is our federal law, the Elementary Secondary Education Act, and state law, and our plans do have to be approved. So, and then we can we can fall into improvement categories by not meeting different cut scores. So we've listed there the measured indicators: academic proficiency, growth, English learner progress, which is going to count in multiple areas, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then growth of the lowest performing 25%. That's really where you're getting your equity piece, is through English learner progress and that growth of the lowest performing students. And then you do have post-secondary readiness indicators that are at the high school level only. And then points are assigned to each indicator and each student group, and I'll kind of show you some of that. Next slide. So this kind of shows you, like when you go onto the data gateway, this shows you what you're going to see. The elementary one is on the left. That's actually, I think, Canyon Crest that I pulled. And then the one on the right is what a middle school looks like, and that's Dixon Middle School. And you'll notice the achievement category is based on, for elementary, RISE data in English Language Arts and Math 3rd through 6th, and Science 4th through 6th. And then growth is English Language Arts, Math, Science, and then a separate indicator for the growth of the lowest 25%. And then you have English learner progress, which they're looking at, does the student make adequate progress in their language development? And then what percentage of your English learners are reaching proficiency? And then our elementary also has early literacy, which is measured through it's not part of the accountability piece, but it is part of something that the state requires us to report on. Did you want to add anything to that? Okay. And then middle school is the same thing. It's RISE testing for those areas. And then notice we don't have the early literacy piece. So, and next slide is what a high school looks like. So this is Provo High School. And notice we've now added a post-secondary readiness indicator. So it's, we're looking at the ACT scores, anyone who scores 18 or higher, and it's only those 11th graders that test on that statewide test in March. And then we're looking at the 4-year graduation rate. So students that enter in that 9th grade year cohort, are they graduating by October 1st of following their senior year? So they do get a little bit of extra time. There is some, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. There are some 5-year trends that actually are added in there. And then readiness coursework is about how many students are taking higher level classes, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. So, and we already talked about this. Some indicators are reported and published, but do not receive points. So participation is percentage of students who completed testing. It's really important to note that if your participation rate is not hitting 95%, then it can actually start to really negatively affect, because if you have students who do not test, not students who opt out, but let's just say you can't find them or you don't get them to finish the test, they don't complete enough of it, those students count as basically not proficient, and so they're pulling your overall numbers down. And so that's why there needs to be concerted effort at every school to try to get every kid tested, or at least to get an opt-out form if parents do not want to participate in that. And then school districts can choose self-reported indicators. A lot of them choose like attendance, for example. And then we also have the early literacy part that's based on Acadians. And we do have an early learning plan, and Anne-Marie has presented on that before. So next slide. So our participation requirements, 95% participation rate. Just wanted to highlight opt-outs don't count against us. If a student simply does not test, they do count in that participation and accountability. It used to be our opt-outs did count against us as well, because that was required by the federal government. That is no longer the case. We have renegotiated that because of state law. So we had a conflict between state and federal law, and we got that resolved. Next slide. So here are some of the changes for 23-24 school year. Letter grades are no longer assigned to schools. So they'll still give you like a scale score and tell you if you're exemplary or typical or what. So you still kind of have a grade. It's just not a letter grade. They've also changed the way in which they calculate student growth, because it was also based on a median growth percentile. We'll talk about how student growth is calculated in just a minute. It makes a lot more sense, and it's a lot easier of a formula to follow. And then English learners, for them to be proficient, have to score a 4.2 on the WIDA Access, which is their assessment, and they do have to score at least a 3.5 on the speaking portion to be considered proficient. And then we are also looking at their progress overall. That's a little more complicated of a formula. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But notice that English learners are counting both in their student group in terms of proficiency and achievement and growth, as well as in the EL progress category. So when people are like, why are we spending so much money on multilingual students? This is why. Like, it counts in so many different avenues, and so many of our multilingual students are also students who are identified with disabilities, and so they're hitting a lot of these markers. And so when we're looking at the money that comes from the federal government and the state for Title III, it is not enough to cover the needs of our English learners. So it really does need to be a significant priority, and it really is coded in this accountability system. So when you get constituents that are asking questions about, why are we adding so much FTE to this? This is because this is how our district will get out of improvement status. This is going to be a really important investment, but also to mention it's the right thing to do, right? So, and then they have changed some of the identification and exit criteria for schools in CSI and TSI status. We'll talk more about that. And there is, of course, now we have a third category of improvement called ATSI, because it wasn't complicated enough before. So you're welcome. All right, next slide. This just lists the student groups of how they disaggregate data. The two areas where I will say statewide where we're falling short is when we're talking about students with disabilities and our multilingual learners. And so you're starting to see, what's interesting is when schools are performing in the bottom 5% of all schools and they're falling into that, they're identifying those every single year. So what we're starting to see is an increased number of schools being identified. So teachers sometimes are like, this doesn't make sense to me, why, when it says bottom 5%, why do we have like 35% of all schools identified now as a TSI school? Or how can I be a really high performing school like Timpview and still be in TSI status, for example? It's because we're looking at these individual student groups, and so we have to look at that more carefully. All right, next slide. So this just kind of shows you the point breakdown. So the top table shows you how the points are allocated for elementary and middle schools. There's no quiz on this, by the way, afterwards. So just so you know, like, I'm not going to ask you. There's no true or false, like 56 points. No, that's not happening. And then it shows you the points for high schools. And the post-secondary readiness then is broken down into different subcategories. So when you're looking at high school, that's why you're seeing those percentages for achievement and growth being less than what you're seeing at the elementary and middle school. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And next slide kind of shows a pie graph that kind of shows you what those indicators are. So that does a really nice job of saying, especially at the secondary level, at the high school level, we need to be paying attention to the classes students are registering for example. We need to be very deliberate in what that looks like. We need to be very deliberate. There are a lot of students that are multilingual learners that don't take the ACT, for example, that just are like, I'm not taking this. Or kids will say, I'm just not going to show up to that because I'm not going to go to college. And we really need to be pushing that, because it gives us a really good indicator of the preparation that our students have gone through to prepare for higher levels of learning and thinking. Okay, next slide. This gets a little more complicated. So, so you'll notice on the left, it talks about all of the pieces that tie into proficiency. So it's going to be broken down, a third of your points from language arts, math, science. The student does have to be enrolled for 160 days. That does not mean they're attending for for 160 days. It just means they were enrolled for 160 days. They have to have a valid score. So if they just log in and they only answer 8 questions and log back out, it's considered a no test, and it will count. It doesn't end up counting. So we have to have a valid score of 85% of the items answered. And then notice that your multilingual learners are not calculated into those proficiency details for the first 2 years, but they are in the 3rd year. So it is seen as that by the time they're reaching that 3rd year, their language development, especially in academic areas, should be high enough that they could perform on these tests. So your school will get an overall score, and you'll get a score in each of those areas, and then all of those student groups that we listed on the last page will also get a sub-score. So you'll see that. Yes, please.
Just to clarify, so the English language learners not counting in the 1st and 2nd year, this is new, or is this how it has been
I
as
need
well?
to ask that. I don't feel like that's new, but
Okay,
I
so
don't.
that part's happened before.
But I don't think that people recognized that. So there was a lot of resentment, and people would say, well, I'm just not going to have my multilingual student take the test. But what you're not recognizing is it establishes that baseline data for those students, and that's really what's going to help us as we look at growth of that student. It is very frustrating for that student to take that test, but now there's so many accommodations in those tests. Like, a student can choose on math and science. If I'm a Spanish speaker, I can get the test in Spanish. There's actually now written into state law, and I don't know that most districts know this, and we did this at a few schools in my former district. You can have the math and science test translated, like an interpreter read the questions and help you with it. So like if you have an Arabic speaking student, you can have it translated for you into Arabic, and they can take the test because it's testing their content. The only test you can't do that with is the language arts test. So, am I saying anything that's wrong? Okay. Okay, excellent. See? Provo City School District, totally ahead of the game there. And then you'll notice it says EL progress details on the right-hand side. You have 13 points possible there, and this is where we're looking for the number of ELs that are reaching proficiency, so they have to score a 4.2 or higher on the WIDA Access. 6 is the highest score they can get, and then notice that your first year ELs are not included in that. We're establishing that baseline data there. And then we're looking at the growth of the lowest 25%. So when we talk about growth, these students are counting in 2 areas. So they're yes, so they're counting in the overall growth, but they're also counting in the growth of the lowest 25%. And so, you know, this is really to target that equity piece, because what was happening under No Child Left Behind was we were focusing on those bubble kids, right? The ones that were level 2 proficient, and we just needed to bump them over the line. That's still important because you want to bump those kids into proficiency, but we also need to be focusing on those kids that are performing at the very lowest levels to see if we can accelerate that growth, and then it will benefit our schools in both areas, and that demonstrates that our equity lens is correctly aligned there. So generally, when we talk with schools about how to focus on this, you don't want to have in my opinion, you don't want to have a single goal like this is how we're going to handle all students. You want teachers to be very deliberate and schools to be very deliberate. So as I'm looking at how do I raise my proficiency rates, I am looking at those bubble kids. I'm also looking at the kids that scored proficient last year and making sure they don't drop down, right? So if they're right on that border, we got to keep their momentum going. And then when we're talking about growth, we're obviously looking at all students, and so that's really important. But a lot of times people are like, oh, it's so much energy to focus on this bottom 25%, but it really, that's why this has been set up that way, is to ensure that we're not leaving those students behind. Yes, please. Oh, no, that's correct. Yes, that's correct. Yep. It's all students. Yes. Yep. Yep. Yep.
It does not usually include the former list of categories.
Yes. Yes. It's going to include a lot of those students. So part of this is, when the state is asking you to create, say, for example, a TSI plan, and they're saying things like you need to account for how you're handling every single student group, we generally tell teachers and schools to focus on your multilingual learners, your students with disabilities, and those students that are not performing. If you do that, you're gonna address all of those student groups. Like you don't need to have separate. You don't need to say, okay, this is how I'm specifically addressing this particular group. There are some places in post-secondary readiness where that could come in, and I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. But so anyway, that tells you about growth. So now high schools, same thing, except we're using Aspire as our test, and it's only 9th and 10th grade. So, and then ACT is your 11th graders. It's the same with your multilingual students. You have notice that those individuals are going to be counted in all of these areas as well. But the post-secondary readiness becomes really important. So anytime a graduation rate, for example, of any of these student groups falls below 67%, it will automatically kick that group into improvement. They're also looking at ACT, that their scores need to be 18 or higher. And then this is where we miss a lot of opportunities. So for students to take an AP or an IB or a CE class, they just need a half a credit. So a CE class just needs to be for a semester, and they just need to earn a grade of C or better. And sometimes we discourage our students that are multilingual learners from taking those courses, and that's not what we should be doing. We should be identifying those entry points. And now our universities are getting a lot better at offering, for example, English language development classes that are actually for those learners, not SLIC. I know you looked at me like that because SLIC is terrible, but we don't go with SLIC is not very accommodating when it comes to that. But through UVU, there are universities that allow our English language learners to go through that quite well. And then the other piece of this is CTE. So as long as the student completes a CTE pathway and they earn a grade of C or higher, this is really a great entry point for students with disabilities, for our multilingual learners. If they're not quite ready for, say, necessarily an AP course, this is an excellent entry point. Our problem is that a lot of times we don't communicate very effectively what those pathways are. And so we're just letting kids sign up for classes that they want. That's great, except maybe we need to direct them more towards the completion of that pathway, because then that student will count in that, and it actually gives them a completed skill set. And so sometimes we're finding that a student doesn't really understand that piece, their parents might not understand that piece, and so they're taking a ton of CTE classes, but because they're not in a pathway, it doesn't count. And that really goes for all students, but in particular a lot of these student groups. And so that's where you could really identify if you do have a school where, say, your Hispanic population, for example, is not meeting those needs, or there's a significant opportunity gap existing. That's where you could be really deliberate in your counseling and making sure that students know what's going on and what courses they should take to help them. So next slide. This is how they do the achievement calculation. No quiz on this after. So next slide. And then this is the growth calculation. So this one is a lot more complicated. So the school's performance is measured by the rate of increase in the student's academic progress, regardless of proficiency over time. What they're looking for is the student making at least a year's worth of progress over the course of that year, right? And you do have to have an SGP for 2 years to be counted in this. So even if I have a multilingual student who comes in, or I have a student who's enrolled for less than 160 days, it's a good idea to establish that baseline data, because then you're getting a baseline score, and then you can start to look at growth over time. So the sooner we can get them into that system, the sooner that student can start to be calculated into growth. And by the way, they don't have to be in your school to have an SGP. They just need to have tested in the state of Utah. So even when they're moving schools, that score still follows them. So it's so that's important to know too, because I think there's a misconception of schools like, well, this student just came in, so I'm not going to worry about it. And it's like, but if they had a test score last year, whatever school that they're enrolled in, that's going to be the school that it counts towards in the long run. So that's what we want. That's what we want to look at. So, yeah, please.
Okay. And is the assessment that's used to measure growth an annual test, or
Yep.
do we do a beginning and end of a school year?
Nope, it's the
a
RISE
little
test.
problematic, right?
Yeah.
Because
It's only
we have
once.
a learning loss over summer, and then we.
Yep.
Okay.
So the way that they're calculating this, and Michelle can step in and help me, is they're looking at every single student that scores this score, and they create like a projected growth of what that should look like. And based on that, if that student meets that projected growth, then they get assigned an SGP. So, and then you'll notice they put a point weight tied to that. Do you want to add anything to that?
No,
It's a very complicated.
if I can share details if you want, because I certainly know them. But basically, students are put in a cohort of has to have at least 3,000 students that score just like they scored, and then there's a distribution 1 to 100. They're bell curved, and the distribution is the growth of how they perform. It's pretty fair, and it's a national. It's used nationally a lot in the growth measure. So, okay, thanks. Yeah.
Okay, next slide. I just pulled out and made sure that you could see this so that it kind of shows that those when the student SGP. So when I'm looking at an SGP, I mean, notice this is saying higher than 80, then you get a 1. I really am trying to get teachers to look at, we want those SGPs to be 60 or higher. Okay, that's really what we're aiming for. So when we start to see SGPs that are sitting around, 42 or 43, that's not what we want. That's holding us back on our growth measures. So, next slide. So same kind of thing happens, except now we're taking the growth of the lowest 25%. So now we're going, so notice it says lowest quartile, that's what LQ stands for, students who have an SGP of greater than 40. So we're acknowledging that this lowest quartile group is struggling, and then we divide that by all students in that group and multiply by 25, and then that's how we get the total points for that growth. Next slide. English learner information for the first year, students exempt from proficiency and growth calculations, but they do take the tests if they are enrolled before April 15th. And so it just establishes participation and baseline data. In second year, it's growth and participation only. Third year, growth and proficiency, and they're now counted in the English learner progress, right? So now we've established in their WIDA like how much their language needs to develop. So next slide. So we talked about 2 scores, adequate progress, reaching proficiency, and adequate progress gets a little complicated. So go to the next slide, because I think I have so this is how they determine adequate progress. So I think there's 3 different tables, if I remember right. It's 1st through 3rd, 4th through 7th, and then 8th through 12th. And so notice along the top, it's the time in the EL program and then their initial level. So they take the WIDA, and let's say they score a 1.2 on the WIDA. So now they're going to be in that top corner there, so in that 1.0 to 1.7. So after 1 year, they should make 1 point jump in growth. So when they take the WIDA again, they should have moved from a 1.2 to a 2.2. So then that student would count as having made adequate progress. The school gets a point for that student. Let's say that student doesn't make that much of a jump, and so then you can kind of see then based on that they alter the points. So that's what that kind of looks like. So you can notice it stops at 4.1 because 4.2 is proficient. And oh, by the way, students that score 4.2 or higher, still start counting, even though they're proficient in EL, they will still count in the student groups. So it's still really important that those students are doing well academically. So we don't just say, oh, excellent, you're now proficient in English, peace out. Like, there still needs to be really deliberate attempts to make sure that they're accessing the academic portions of their schedule, not just the language development, because they're still counting in proficiency and growth on RISE and ASPIRE testing. So that just kind of shows you, why, for example, if a student has been enrolled, like we'll sometimes get a middle school student, or I would have this at the high school sometimes, where you would have a student that had been a level 3 for multiple years, and then all of a sudden they jump, and they have never jumped before. You're still not getting the full points for that because they have been enrolled in the program for so long. And so we really have to start paying attention to the amount of time that that student is enrolled, and is being identified at that level, and be very deliberate in that. So, next slide. Yes.
Wendy, can I jump in there?
Please.
I just want to acknowledge and remind you, you approved that large purchase of Elevation, that computer software program. One of the things that program does for us is help calculate all that data that she just showed. So prior to that program, we had no way of helping schools know, did your students meet their growth goals or not. We were just like, because you can see how complicated that formula is. So it was really hard when TSIs first started happening, because we couldn't see which kids met their goals or not. We were just guessing. So I just want to say thank you for approving that, because it's really helped us target and sort our long-term EL students, just like what Wendy referred to. So it's been incredibly beneficial this year already. So thank you.
Well, and it does a really nice job too of showing, like, this is where we want this student to be when they take the WIDA this next time, and then the student knows what they're going for, because a lot of times they're like, why am I taking this test? Like, I don't even know what this is for. I'm not taking this. So that's what's really helpful there. And now we have post-secondary readiness. This is a little more straightforward, and we talked a little bit about that with the readiness coursework. So notice that the readiness coursework and the graduation rate will not calculate in until the student has graduated. So it's only including 12th graders each year when it comes in there. Now notice this, you do receive some points for those who graduate within 5 years, but it's a tiny, tiny percentage. So it's still trying to acknowledge that if the student gets across the finish line, and that can be helpful, especially if you're getting a student that's new to country or something like that, and they start 9th grade and they've never been in an English-speaking country, then that can help. So, next slide. Questions about accountability, rules, indicators, or formulas? Don't ask me about the formulas. I'm not a statistician. We could get Nate in here if you had questions about the formulas. Okay, next slide. So now this is going to talk a little bit about the improvement piece. So we identify those schools in need of support based on the points calculated, then they rank all of the schools, and the Title I schools get ranked, and all the student groups get ranked. The cut score that you have to meet is determined by the lowest 5% of Title I schools. So that's where they'll say everybody that's above this is fine, anyone that's below this is not. Next slide. And this is a lot of information, but this is actually super helpful. So it kind of gives a summary of each of these. So TSI status applies to any school, it's not just a Title I school, but all we're looking for is student groups. We're not looking at the overall school performance. And so that student group is being compared to the bottom 5% of Title I schools. We don't have a lot of Title I schools, to be quite honest, at the high school level. But it's still looking at the bottom 5% of those student groups across the board. So, and if you get identified as a TSI school, if your group is in the lowest 5% for 2 consecutive years. So we actually can get a heads up if we look at those cut scores. And that's where, like, TIMFU's been really trying to be proactive, because they know they're right on the cusp with their English learners. And so while they're low on special ed as well, they've already been taking they've been very proactive when it comes to their multilingual learners. So, and then if you stay at TSI school, you don't exit after 4 years, you get moved to a school with additional targeted support and improvement. And so these get identified once every 3 years. It does apply to all schools. You had to have been a TSI school previously. And then we're looking at that student group's 3-year average has to be below the lowest performing 5%. And so then it throws you into this ATSI status, and the state just does a little bit more. I don't think there's money tied to it unless we go into Elevate and Springboard, which hasn't started yet. I think they're trying to create an improvement system to start the process of getting the legislature to appropriate some more funding for this. And so I think that's part of the reason why they're looking at this, because the other piece of this is we used to say, well, what are they going to do if we're in TSI status for more than 4 years? Like what legitimately happens? I mean, if you're not a Title I school, they're not cutting off funding to you. So, like, what is the consequence of that? And so they're adding this other layer here to try to help intensify that. And then notice comprehensive support and improvement is identified once every 3 years based on 3-year averages. It can be a Title I low performing school. So this would be like where Franklin Elementary is falling. It can also be a low graduation rate, so Independence High School, and can also be targeted CSI, where you have a Title I school that fell into TSI status, then went into ATSI status, and they did not exit from there. So then they would fall into CSI. But notice that that is for a Title I school that's doing that. To exit your TSI, it's now 1 year of the student group has to be above the cut score, and you get those 4 years to get out. And it used to be you had to have 2 consecutive years, so they've made that a little bit easier there. And then to exit ATSI or CSI for targeted CSI, you have to reduce the gap in performance by 1/3 between the school's baseline performance when they were identified, and they have to earn 55% of all indicator points possible. So that's for elementary and middle, and then for high school they have to earn 57%. And then the school or the student group must exceed the lowest, still has to be above that cut score. So they didn't require before that the gap be closing in that. And so that's what's really important as well.
They also, I will add, the biggest change that's great here is the schools are held accountable for the cut score where they were, the year they were identified. Prior to this change last month, the cut score, they had a moving target.
Yeah.
So if the cut score was 30 in 2018, and last year the cut score was 40, the 2018 schools were expected to get above that 40, even though when they were identified it was 30. So
Yep.
that is no longer the rule. Now it's the year you identified. If you get above that cut, the year you are identified.
Okay, next slide. And we now have Elevate Schools. It is an application-based model. You do get quite a bit of funding tied to it. I can't remember what the amount is. It's a lot. It's like $200,000 or something like that. So I had one of our middle schools in our last district apply for this, and part of the reason why sometimes schools hesitate is because the state requires the staff to go through their professional development, and sometimes I don't love that because I don't always love what they provide. I'm going to be honest, like I don't have any say in that. And so anyway, so we just need to, that would be something to look at. So we didn't apply for one last year, but, and it can be an elementary school, a middle school, or a high school. It's just a school that's in that TSI status that are non-Title I. So we can get additional funding in there. So like when we're looking at, like if we were going to look at and say, do we want to do something like that with Provo High? Do we want to do something like that with Dixon Middle School? With that additional funding and us targeting those student groups, would that be beneficial? And what does that look like? And then Springboard schools will start in 25, 26. We'll talk about that next year. I'm not going to worry about that right now. Next slide. So these are the schools that are, I'm going to let Michelle talk about this. These are the schools that have been identified as ATSI. They have previously been TSI. And notice that Franklin is crossed off because they're now in CSI status. Do you want to talk a little bit about these and why Provost, Sunset View, and Timpanogos are in yellow? Is there a reason?
They're Title I.
Oh, that's why.
And if they don't exit, they will become
CSI.
category this year.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, so that's why. I knew there was a reason and I was trying to look at that. So we could potentially end up with 4 schools that are in CSI status. So that's what makes me very anxious. And then you'll notice it tells you which categories each of these schools are sitting in that ATSI status for. So, and then she indicated like what cut score, what year we're using that cut score from. So you can see because of this list, that's why we're a district that's in improvement overall. I think they call us a tier 3 district. So we get to meet with the state and they check in with us, kind of see what our plans are, and they want more accountability from us as to what we're doing. Next slide. We already talked about that. Next slide. Questions? That's a lot of information. You're welcome. Very early in the morning. Well, I'm kind of surprised you don't have a question. I feel like you would have a question.
Lisa does.
Oh, go.
I don't really have a question. I just have a comment. Like, thank you for summarizing this so well, because I did read that manual, and I was like, a couple paragraphs I put into Chat GPT and was like, tell this to me like I'm 16. And then I didn't have to lower, but sometimes I do. But anyway, my comment is just this: like, while this is all really complicated and we need to use it to drive resource allocation, et cetera, it's also important because the thought that goes and the theory of action that goes behind this is to say this is how we know we are educating kids. So even though what we're going to be talking about are how to get our schools out of improvement or how to hit score numbers, it's not because we just care about the number or the score or we're going to get FTEs to get our rankings higher. It's because we want to make sure we are equitable and looking to make sure every student has a chance to access a free and appropriate education. And so I just wanted to say that because sometimes when we start talking about this, people will say, you're just focused on your ranking or your score. But every one of these numbers represents how we're doing at preparing kids for the rest of their lives and how well are we fulfilling our mandate as public ed. So I think this is really important, and I'm just grateful that you put all this time into making it a little easier for us to digest and think about and use.
Actually, I'm not supposed to be the one that's calling on you.
Do we have any Title I schools that are not on this?
Yes, we do.
And what school is that?
So Amelia's not on there. We have 7 Title I schools.
Okay.
Spring Creek is not.
Spring Creek is not on there.
So we've got 3 schools who are on here, so that means 4 are not. So we have more Title I schools not on ATSI than we do on. Yep. And I'm sure you guys are already on this, but are we looking at what they are doing or what they are able to do that keep, because my assumption is that Title I schools have a higher number of the groups of students that were up there. And so are we looking at what they're doing? Is there things we can learn from them, or is it just completely different things that we can't compare?
Go ahead, Michelle.
I would say, I would answer that to be yes, we have systems in place where they can collaborate and can share with one another. We have those systems in the organization. Whether or not schools choose to participate in that sharing is independently up to them. But we have structures and support. If you want to talk specific, like I'll just go interventions for MLs. Every elementary school has access to and all the same materials, curriculum, support, funding according to their, calculated needs. So the equity, it's not, Rock Canyon doesn't have any, they only have 20, so they don't have any materials, and Timpanogos has everything they need. That's not the case at all. So just looking at things a little bit more strategically probably.
Thank you. And then I know that there are, or I think that there are, this is going to be the wrong terminology, so you'll have to fix it for me, but levels, right? So we have some that there's a score about, that I think is about generational poverty. There's that kind of a score. And then there's also the number of free and reduced lunches, which I think has something to do with something. Are our schools that are, again, this is going to be completely wrong, more Title I, like they have more poverty in the schools, are they the ones that are on here?
No. Really great question. Really great question. You would make that assumption that there'll be correlates to those things, but that's not how the accountability system, it's not true. You would think that because of what we know about impact, but so much of what happens at a school depends on school leadership and teacher experience and I mean so many other things besides those demographics. The IGP that you just referred to or all those statistics, you know, all those data points don't play into the point system, but for sure can impact what's happening in a school. So I can give you an example. Sunset View and Amelia are typically, if you just looked at free and reduced lunch numbers, are typically pretty close and have been for probably 15 years. But if you break apart the free and reduced part and the low level MLs and the high level MLs, Sunset View is actually a little bit more impacted. So they're on this list. Could that be something that impacts them? Maybe, but it's such a big maybe to do that, right? That you look at Spring Creek, Spring Creek, Timpanogos, and Franklin pretty much tie for the most impacted across the city, and they're not on here. Timpanogos is for students with disabilities and did really great last year, so almost out. So that's an interesting thing to talk about. I mean, to think about. So we'd like to do correlate, but
Okay, thank you.
Also, I just want, oh, sorry, I was just going to say, I'm looking at these students with disabilities groups and seeing the consistency with which they end up flagged as not having what they need in order to make the progress they need, and I think that's important.
I have a question, comment. Do you have one too, Terry? Go ahead.
I do. One of the things I noticed that's not on the student groups is high mobility, and that also affects scores. So what's the state, do they not consider it a problem?
It is a problem. It's very difficult to measure. So let me give you an example. You do have, they will consider mobility, particularly when like they're dealing with like intergenerational poverty grants. Then they'll publish what the mobility rate is of the school, and we definitely see high mobility rates in a lot of our most highly impacted schools. But you actually also have high mobility rates in really high economic areas, and it's because the way they measure mobility is it's any student who attends 2 or more schools in 160 days. So part of your problem is, especially in some of your high economic areas, kids will be coming in from a charter school, for example, or they'll leave a public school and go to a charter school. All of a sudden they get flagged as highly mobile, and so you'll get
Even though
these.
they have the same address.
So yes, right. So they take it based on entrance and exit from school rather than their address. That is correct. Now when you go into the IGP piece of it, those numbers come from the county, and the county is taking into account the address part. So that's why mobility is just something that they have not taken into consideration. They do report out on the state's accountability report. They will report out by McKinney-Vento students. So they will show you how many students are experiencing homelessness and what their percentage is. And in fact, when you use that number, that's where you really see significant opportunity gaps. There is when you start pulling those numbers, because those graduation rates are significantly lower overall. So that's a great question.
Terry, too, that subgroup list is ethnicity and identified, right, populations of students with need, not demographic. So it would be the same as if they used free and reduced lunch as an indicator in that subgroup, right? It's a reported piece of information that helps us in school planning. I think the other thing with mobility is remembering in the point system, they have to be enrolled for 160 days in the school. So those mobile kids that come in and out are taken out. What was your question?
So, okay, this is super helpful for me to see and to learn and to see the changes and whatnot. And it seems very helpful to us as a district too, knowing where we need to focus, right? So how do we let this, knowing all of this, well, first of all, does everybody else also know all of this? Because it seems like a lot of people need to know this. But second of all, if is how do we let this influence like how our teachers and our admin are trained? Does that make sense? Because I think everybody should know this and let it help them set their focuses and right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. So I think part of this is the next step, right, is to take this out to schools. And part of this too is this is just where we are. This is not an accusation. This is not an indictment of anyone. This is our reality. And what do we think we need to do? I think we have some ideas as an MTSS about some approaches that we would have and as a cabinet. But also schools are going to know, and to your point, Gina, about why, for example, Spring Creek or Timpanogos they're doing better. Like when I was talking with Carrie, the principal at Timpanogos, she was talking about how she doesn't have quite the turnover in her staff. So a number we would want to look at is what does teacher turnover look like at these different schools, and yet you go to Franklin and you're noticing that a significant portion of that staff is within its first 2 years, right? So the experience and the training and what can we do in that respect. And I also think, are we really utilizing, to Michelle's point, I think we really can start to utilize our PLCs to a much more effective degree if we can start saying, hey, this third grade team at this school is really struggling. We need you to go see what third grade is doing over at this school. We don't have to go outside of Provo City School District. I think all the time we think, well, we got to take them to California to find a really great school. And it's like, you really don't. There's amazing stuff happening right here in our district. And we need to be utilizing those individuals and capitalizing on that. So that would be another piece of that is, how do we get that information and that knowledge out? And so that kind of leads us also into the rest of our discussion for the morning about FTE as one solution and talking about, we're also going to talk about retention of teachers. How do we recruit the best teachers to the district, and especially to our most highly impacted schools? So, go ahead.
Will part of that discussion be, for example, Timpanogos and Franklin, I think, have very similar populations? And and maybe we can't even ask this when someone leaves, but do we know why teachers leave at a higher rate at some schools than others, and is that something we can target? Is that stuff we'll talk about later?
Yes, and
Okay.
we actually were talking about this. I think I was talking with Daryl about this. He made a suggestion of an exit. I don't know if we do this, but in some districts they do an exit survey with each employee that leaves, and they identify so that you find out, am I leaving because my husband got a job somewhere, or my wife got a job somewhere, or I'm going to graduate school, or I'm retiring, or am I leaving because I transferred to another district? Is it because of pay? Is it, what's happening? Is it because I'm not getting the support that I need with behavior? All of those things we need to have that data, because we can't we're guessing at why that turnover exists.
So we do
we do an exit survey.
Yeah.
Okay, so that would be good data for us as an MTSS and cabinet to pull and look at. So that would be an action item for us.
Sorry, does that include, this probably does not then include what you're talking about, Jason, if they transfer schools, right? Because if they're going from a Title I-ish school to a higher performing school, I don't know if there's, I'm just spitballing here, but that might be helpful information that I don't know that's even legal or ethical for us to gather, but that would be helpful information for us to have if they're leaving, why they're leaving and why they would go to a different school within the district.
Yeah, you're right. We currently don't track the people who transfer from one school to another internally as far as keeping that as an ongoing data piece, but we do use the exit survey for people who've indicated they're not returning. One of the things with the exit survey is, we can't really require it. We use a carrot, we pay them if they'll do it, a little bit extra if they'll complete it. A lot of people choose not to. But again, we try to do things to motivate people to participate.
Thanks.
I have a question. As this data is released to teachers, do we use PLC time within schools to look at their school's data and the district data? I just am remembering sitting in a meeting like this once in a school out of state where we were looking at the fourth grade math and looking even down to the granular level of teachers, not who's the better teacher, but who might have some resources that like help us know how your students, like that level of time to really use that data to then build and share tools to support students with some of this. Because as I was looking through some of the science and math, especially data, I was just thinking, how can we help? Like how can we help use this data?
So I think that's, I don't know if this is on anymore. Oh, I hear it. Oh, good. Okay. I think that is, I don't think we've been very good about requiring that as being something that we've, I think there are a lot of teachers who are using data, but they use it a lot to determine tier 2 interventions, especially at the elementary school. So how am I going to group students? Rather than looking at it and saying, okay, where do we want to be in I would really like us to start looking at some 90-day plans. Like, where do we want to be in 90 days? What does this look like? What's a reasonable amount of growth that should be taking place? And then teaching teachers that they are experts, like they have a lot of skills, and they should be using their own formative assessments and then on a weekly basis adjusting their tier 1 instruction about what's happening. I think PLCs has really kind of shifted towards a tier 2 model. I think sometimes at the secondary level it becomes also we're going to look at this data so that we know which test questions to throw out for next year. We're not even looking at it in terms of formative pieces of data. So we're really trying to see a culture shift with that and to identify those teams that are doing this well so that can be shared. And we have established that pretty quickly or pretty clearly in our PLC expectations about this is what this needs to happen.
Yeah, because I think we see that there's if someone's got something that's working great at tier 1, to hit a concept right now is a great time to share that. It's not because the number matters, but it's because that might help us find the people who can help us.
That's right. Absolutely.
I have one more. So something that's really been bothering me about Franklin's CSI is that Mr. Benson found me on the playground picking up my son from school and told me about it. That's how I found out about this. And when he told me, I'm like, what the crap is CSI? I'd never heard of this before. I'd never heard of TSI. Clearly Franklin was TSI before it became CSI, but I didn't know. Like, my request is that can the board have a list of all the schools that are TSI, ATSI, CSI, and any of the schools that are on the cusp of becoming TSI? And can all the community councils have this information for their individual schools, because then they know where to put their money, because that will help them plan for their trust land money plan, because I was really annoyed that Jason came and told me on the playground instead of learning about it in a board meeting or a board email or something like that. Like, that was ridiculous.
So absolutely, and every school should know what their status is, and Michelle's a great help in helping us do that. I think I love the idea that our school community councils would know that information as well. And I think the other piece is we've been doing school improvement plans, but as we've been talking as a cabinet and as an MTSS group, my concern is that those school improvement plans have always been due like in August or September, and really they should be due when we're putting together our land trust plans and our TSSA plans, right? So we have a subcommittee that's been made up of school leadership, and I think Michelle is helping with that. I think Anne-Marie is helping with that, and putting together a new template that we are going to expect schools to utilize. And what that template will then address is not only do you have to have these improvement goals, but you have to be addressing if you are in this ATSI status. It will also address the requirements of the Title I plan, and it'll be in a single document. It will have those goals, it will have specific action items, and then the monetary pieces of it will be listed in there, and how they're funding it. So am I funding this out of my general fund? Am I funding this additional help from land trust? Is it coming from Title I? So it's very transparent, and then parents will know, well, if we want to do this, this would be a great help, but we're going to need to use TSSA money to be able to do that. Meg, go ahead.
Well, this came up when I was at Wasatch, their community council, and Principal Furman just kind of brought up like the timing of the different plans and when he had to report on them, and not like saying it was hard to do, it just didn't quite make sense. So thank you. I think this is much needed, and it definitely came up at Wasatch. So
yeah, so we'll align that, and then we'll get those plans to the board, and then the schools that you're responsible for, you would be reading those. So our school leadership team and our cabinet will read over those, provide feedback, right? And then in addition to that, that'll come to the board, and then you can ask questions and say, tell me more about this, or how else can we help? But then also by all of you understanding what's happening in those plans, there may be points at which you're saying, you know, as a board, we need to be allocating and looking at this and working with Derek's team to figure out how can we further supplement these things. Are there other pots of money that we can be utilizing, or is there a better way to utilize these resources? So, and then just having it all on one template, it can be on their website. We can then backwards design that, right? So now you have, so this will happen in the first 90 days, and these are going to be our indicators, and then we can address it and adjust it. We can report out to our school community councils about how we're doing. There's an accountability piece, but also then your school community council is like, oh my gosh, I know these people are working so hard and it's still a struggle. Like, what else can we do? You know, I think sometimes we don't like having these conversations because we feel like it's a gotcha moment. I don't feel that way. We have an obligation to educate our children and to support our schools effectively, and to make sure our teachers are supported and our principals are supported, but we can't do that if we don't know what the underlying issues are, right? So that's really the purpose of this. And I think I know for me, like a lot of times when you have to do a plan, it was like, I'm just doing this as a checkbox, right? I just have to check the box that this is happening. But if I really know that people are listening as to what the needs of my school, you know, really are, and that there will be resources allocated, then I'm going to take that very seriously. So, and I've taken way too much time on this topic, but I feel like it's really important.
I was just going to say we are about ready to move on. It
Yes.
rolls into the next topic anyways,
does.
but we are about 12 minutes behind, so we may want to just keep that in mind.
Yep.
We're moving on to item number 6 now, the FTE structure.
So, Bonnie, will you pull up the Excel spreadsheet that says, did we attach this in board docs?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Pull up that spreadsheet for me. So, those of you that were at the USBA leadership, there was an individual that was talking about Steve Diamond as being a teacher that had changed his life. Well, Steve Diamond is the HR director in Canyons District, and he is the individual that kind of created a really interesting FTE allocation spreadsheet. Is it opening, Bonnie? It wants to. It's okay, it's just slow. We have to make it very big because some of us have very old eyes.
Mine is like so big.
There we go. Oh, that's much better. Perfect. Okay. So he just threw, and it says middle schools out there, but he just threw in he was being very helpful to me because I sent him an email and said, can I have a copy of this, of the FTE equity sheet that we did? So he went in and he like changed the header, and he did all of this for me. So I just huge shout out to him. So one of the suggestions that I wanted us to look at, and just something that we could start to develop with Derek's team, is they list all of the schools, and then they do their enrollments. So they enter in the enrollments based on the grade level. And he just pulled off schools. So obviously Amelia Earhart is not a middle school. So this is just a fictional thing. So that number that's in purple that says adjusted enrollment grade 6, 26.3, that's the student to teacher ratio. So 26.3 is what a lot of districts use at the secondary level. And then they put in the total number of students, and then you'll notice that they subtract out for self-contained special education students. Now, I will argue that I have some issues with that because our goal is always to push our special education students into mainstream classes as much as possible. And when you don't give FTE allocation for that, it can really overload your elective courses. So yes, while they might be self-contained for, especially at the secondary level for some of their core classes, we want them being pushed out into electives, and so I would want that formula changed slightly so that schools are getting credit for those students. Then they calculate a total enrollment based on that, and then they calculate what the FTE would be just based on numbers. So if we're looking at this, fictional school, Amelia Earhart, that's a fictional middle school, the total FTE would be 35.29. What they do is you don't usually award a 0.29 FTE, usually award it in quarter increments, and so they would give 35.25. Then as you go over the, in some other models, they identify what they want their risk factors to be, okay? And these are just some that have been used in other districts, but these would be things that we would want to have a conversation about as to what we want our risk factors to be. So for example, we identified how many multilingual students there were that were at level 1, 2, or 3, because those are the students that need those services. And then he's multiplying it by a factor because we're not going to award FTE at the same level, right, as it's just extra. So, and I'll talk a little bit about how they come up with those formulas here in just a minute. So if, for example, Amelia had 200 students, then they would get an additional 1.08 FTE as a result. You would round that down, it would be an additional 1, right? And then they decided that instead of focusing on just the same factors that are listed in TSI status, they wanted to focus on students that were below basic, so this is that lowest quartile, right? Below basic in reading and below basic in math. And then they added in those numbers to distribute additional FTE because we know we have to do additional interventions for those students. And so this is benefiting all students across the district, right? Not just at certain schools that have been identified. And then they did do mobility rate, to Terry's point. So we did make that a factor because when we put in low income as a factor, there was not the opportunity gap on low income that there was when we were dealing with McKinney-Vento or we were dealing with mobility. So you could also substitute this with McKinney-Vento if you wanted to. But low income students, for example, at a high income school there is not a significant opportunity gap as there is for low income students at a school that has a lot more challenges. So just kind of keep that in mind. That could be any factor you wanted it to be. So they went and put in a mobility rate over those over 3 years, and then any school that had above a 16% mobility rate, then they would be awarded some significant FTE, and they would put in the total numbers there, and then you would get an additional allocation there. And then this is where he was adding back for those self-contained students. So went back and identified that they are participating in electives. And then they also added a DLI impact because they did recognize that sometimes, especially at the elementary school, if you wanted to have, say, for example, you have 2 DLI classes and you wanted to have 2 non-DLI classes, you were going to have to supplement that. You couldn't do that just based on numbers. And so they did go in and put in a DLI FTE impact. They did not do this at the secondary schools because there were enough students enrolled in DLI that they could cover it and have an elective tied to it. And so schools just had to cover that on their own. And then SALTA is like their CAS program. So this is their gifted and talented, and that would only be in those schools that held that program. So then what you get is you get that equitable FTE compact, and it would tell you how many additional FTEs should be allocated to that school. And then what they had to do is, because it was saying, okay, for these schools it was 22.78, Well, let's say they didn't have that kind of allocation. So if you look down at the bottom, it will say allocation from cushion to the middle schools. That was what cabinet had decided the middle schools could have. So it was only 6.8 extra that they could actually afford. So they needed 22, but they could only afford the 6.8. And so he had to take a percentage of that. That's where you get the 29.85%. And so that's why the equitable FTE outcome goes from a 2.36 down to a 0.5, for example. But it's being applied to every school in the same way. So it's not like, well, this principal calls up, somebody and says, hey, I need an extra FTE, and they get it, and this principal just tries to make it work, and they don't get it. And so it's an attempt to do that. So this is just one of the ways in which you can really make it very transparent, and this would be something where we would have to decide that we're holding back what number of FTE. We would call it an FTE. I'm sure there already is an FTE cushion where we hold back some, so if schools have different enrollments or whatnot. But from there, then you would then allocate that according to a formula, and we could decide what we wanted that to be and kind of look at that. And if there were categories you didn't want to have, then, like maybe DLI you don't want to have, so then you pull that one off, or you don't want to have a CAS piece of that. So anyway, so that, I just wanted to introduce that and ask really if this is something we want to pursue as a way to start addressing some of the issues with our schools that are in this ATSI status, so that it really becomes a little more transparent as to how that happens, so that our schools are really clear about what's heading in their direction in terms of the numbers of teachers and how that's formed.
I got a question. So like if we decide we want to go with something like this, who's involved in deciding what all of our factors are that we're looking at?
So that would be, so we would probably make a recommendation to the board, and then you guys, so cabinet would make a recommendation, and then you would determine what you wanted those factors to be. And then Derek's team would decide how much money we have and give some proposals about what that looks like in terms of the overall FTE. So HR usually works very closely with the BA to make those determinations. So
okay, I love this idea. How does this work with when we're trying to keep teachers from moving around a lot too? Because this is encourage.
Well, we're going to get to that part in just a minute. So
feels like this maybe encourages like movement when you want to almost keep, right? So can we just also figure out a way how to keep teachers steady and not move around just because we need a half here and then a half there next year and then right?
Right, and so one of the things that then happens is, like, if we look at a school, for example, I mean, we would then have like a 4-hour FTE meeting. I'm sure you do the same thing here, and you would look at what do the numbers allocate, and you would add in this equity model, but sometimes then it's going to be like, oh, we have a 3rd grade class that has 35 students in it. We can't do that. Then cabinet would say we need to add an FTE here, and so we would have to figure out where are we going to pull it from somewhere else. Is there another place? And often what would happen, I'm going to be really honest, is we would sit in that meeting and say, the high school has $700,000. They're paying for that FTE out of their budget, and we're pulling it from the high school, and we're giving it to the elementary. Like, I think we also have to look at where is our priority. Are we going to put a majority of the FTE towards the elementary? Are we putting it to elementary and middle school? Are we going to request that the high schools utilize a lot of their extra, I mean, they have a lot of extra funding. What does that look like? Is there a huge difference between Timpview and Provo? Because in my mind there would be. Those are all conversations we would want to have as part of that. So, and then this just makes sure that these, I think what this actually does, Rebecca, is I actually think it makes sure that those teachers stay, because if I'm an English language development teacher at Dixon Middle and I know that this FTE is going to be continually allocated, I don't have to worry about that position is going to go away because enrollment drops, because that has been identified as a priority.
Got it.
That makes sense.
Do you know historically, like we've never done anything like this, so we have no historical data, but the man who created this and uses this, how often do the allocations change from school to school? Like, is it pretty typical, like, do they probably see the same thing every year?
Yes,
Right, okay.
and what's interesting is they did all of this with the middle schools and elementary schools, imagining that they had an endless supply of FTE, right? And then they put in all of the factors, and they looked at how much additional FTE would be awarded to schools, and then they ranked those schools based on kind of their risk factors, and it aligned exactly. The schools that had the greatest need were the ones that this formula punched out as they need the most FTE coming through that. So it really did create a transparent way, but also made it so it's not like, do you need 3? Do you need 2? Do I need 1.5? Now I know.
There's no guessing.
Yeah.
Okay. There's lots of questions, and people are pointing to Doug, or no, to Ed. You're pointing to Melanie. Okay, I'm aware. All right, Melanie has a question, then Meg has a question, and then I'll look at this.
I don't have a question, but more of a statement. I just really think that this is where our district is starting to go, where we're become more data driven. And so I really appreciate if we could go this direction. I guess another question for Derek with this. With Domo, does Domo do anything similar with this? Or do we take the information from Domo and put it in here?
That's a good question. There's Domo is not being utilized currently for this, but it has the ability to do everything that we've talked about. We can create these dashboards for schools. We could put the suite of scorecards on and have the calculations in Domo. We can literally do everything that we're talking about in Domo here and make it to where there's publicly viewable dashboards and privately viewable dashboards.
I just think having the data is going to help answer, well, why is my position being eliminated or added? Like, it answers a lot of questions.
Any guesswork, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's what I love about this, too. No guesswork at all and complete understanding, right? Okay, Meg?
What type of, like, can you anticipate pushback, like, in the schools from administrators? I'm curious, like, yeah, what that may look like, and
where you get significant pushback is you're going to have individuals who say, why do we keep putting so much money towards the schools that have the greatest need? Like why my student isn't included in this? My student is a white student who's high income, who's this, and you're not allocating any additional FTE. Where's the column for gifted students, right? And so that's where your pushback is going to come, right? And that's why I wanted to start this conversation with the accountability report, because when we look at how those students are doing, we need to start looking at those students as well to see how are we performing in comparison to the state with that, and are we providing, we need to be very transparent about all of the opportunities we're providing those students so that we can say, this is about closing an opportunity gap that is existing statewide, nationwide. This is not unique to Provo City School District. But we also need to ensure our parents that we're not taking away from anybody. This is really truly to just be very intentional to make sure that students are getting the support that they need. And notice when we start looking at students that are below basic in something, it doesn't matter what your demographic background is. We're providing you with that service. And then if there are other issues, and I think this is going to come out in the strategic plan, if there are other issues, say for example like our accelerated students and what opportunities do they have, then that's something that we will then problem solve and say, are we feeling like these classes that we're offering are not challenging enough? What does that look like? It probably doesn't need additional resources for that. It needs probably some training and making sure those expectations are high and just some reframing more. This really requires intensive curriculum, different structures in the schedule, things like that. So
Well, and we do measure growth for
Yes.
our accelerated students as
Yes.
well. And I just had that conversation with a parent, like, this accountability measure is making sure that a year of growth happens whether you're proficient or not,
Yep.
right? Interestingly, when I looked at Derek's numbers from a different document on here and took our current enrolled students and their FTEs, not all but the contracted ones that were listed, and we had a range from 22.5 up to 27.9, just our elementary schools. And then I tagged them Title I, DLI, where our gifted and talented, there was no correlation actually between those numbers.
Right.
And so I just think having some clarity around how those decisions do get made would be really helpful.
Yep. Gina.
That was actually one of my questions, which we won't answer here, is how are we doing it now? Let's not talk about that. I want to make sure, well, let me make sure I understand this. These are fictitious numbers.
Yes, all fictitious.
So the public, these are fictitious numbers. I just want to be clear. And then, so I love this. I lean toward doing something like this. I like data. I agree with Melanie, and I would appreciate this. I do, one of my things that I write, I always forget what I'm going to say, so I wrote it down, but one was we're going to get pushed back and people are going to feel like we're taking away, so I like the approach that you're thinking about taking if we do this. One of the questions I have is, this is great, and what happens once they make the progress? If I'm looking at it right, once they make a little more progress, is that right? Then they're going to lose an FTE, but my guess is you're going to need FTE to maintain progress. Is that correct? Have we thought about that?
Yes. So that's a great question, and I actually think that would be an amazing problem to have. Like if we had the problem where our kids were like making that kind of progress, I would be like, that's incredible. So then what we would want to do is probably come back and re-examine these formulas, right? And say, what are we going to do to sustain this? And what does this look like? So this is not static. We don't need to keep this for the next 30 years. This is something where we probably need to revisit it every single year and say, what are we hoping the metrics, like what is the student performance going to be coming out of this? How long is that going to take for us to see that momentum? And then as that momentum builds, then let's re-examine this and see where do we need to put some more of those resources. So, I'll give you a great example of something that comes to mind, and I apologize, this is a secondary example, but that's my background. So, there's never enough FTE really to ever provide, for example, this kind of support in a high school schedule for a student who needs to take an AP or a CE class and have actually a teacher work with them on building the study skills to handle that class for the numbers of students that we want. And even then, you probably don't have enough TSSA and land trust money to cover that. But we could probably get more kids to be able to perform at that level if we had the ability to do that. So if kids start progressing and moving towards grade level, then do we start looking at, do we need to provide more of those supports at the high school level for that, and shift those resources as these kids start coming up? We just need to be really mindful of that and keep looking at our data constantly to see if we're really putting our resources where we need them to go.
Thanks.
So that's one idea. Okay. Next discussion. How far behind am I, Rebecca?
Well, we're pretty far.
Okay.
We're supposed to start at 9:35 on the Title I discussion. It's 10:02.
So. Oh, okay. I'll be really fast. So one of the questions that keeps getting asked is really about how to retain our teachers and really how to look at keeping them at our most highly impacted schools. And so this is really just to start that conversation, but you also need to realize that there's a significant cost dedication to it. So the FTE formula is one way where we can do that, and that really is distributing our resources across the district. We could also use some indicators to identify our most highly impacted schools and really do something very intentional. So for example, if you have a school that goes into CSI status, one of the things that you could start to look at is the idea of, do we want to pay teachers to have a longer contract at a school like, say, Franklin Elementary? Maybe they would go to a 196-day contract, and what we're paying them for is additional professional learning to go through coaching cycles, possibly also because it takes them more preparation time or things like that. Do we fund it in that way where a teacher then is making more money as a result of putting in additional work? Do we put in 90-day plans and add bonuses tied to performance indicators? Like if students are making X amount of growth, then they get a $250 bonus for each subject or something like that. It's really really important to recognize that those kinds of incentives, probably for a school, say the size of Franklin, is gonna cost you anywhere from $150,000 to about $300,000 per year to sustain that. And so if that's something we want to explore, then you could direct us as an MTSS and cabinet to start looking at, but recognizing that's now gonna pull out of that pot of FTE, or we could use some of that CSI money, and because the school does get those improvement funds, is that something we want to do? Do we want to provide that school regardless with a full-time assistant principal to support with behavior? Do we want to provide that school with 1 or 2 full-time instructional coaches with certain expectations of, I think there's a lot of different things that we can do. Do we want to, I know Salt Lake District in one instance, they took teachers and they identified teachers in highly impacted schools that had the highest results, and they personally invited them to apply for openings at schools that were really struggling. But then you also want to look at the impact that has. You start pulling large numbers out of other highly impacted schools, so we would want to have some guardrails on that, right? So that, because it doesn't do any good to rob Peter to pay Paul, right? So just being mindful of those things, and so we can start to put together some of those proposals, but I didn't know what your overall thoughts were and what you wanted to do with, if you would like us to go in that direction, or concerns or questions that you have.
Melanie?
Have we surveyed the teachers of what they feel would be best to keep them at that school? Like, what would motivate them?
Somebody needs to write that down. We'll do that as an action item.
I'm just saying, like,
it's great.
Like, and even in asking, teachers at a non-Title I school to say, what would motivate you to come to want to teach over at this Title I school, or to stay? Like, what?
That's great.
I think we really need to ask the teachers, because they're the ones being most impacted here.
I think that's an excellent point.
I was just gonna say, I think these are all great ideas, and I think we should do something, but we can't do all of them either, right? So I think a survey would be good. Also, if there is any data from other districts who have implemented certain things, which ones are more effective, if we can determine that. So, I mean, off the top of my head, I think incentivizing teachers with more money could be very helpful, right? But the instructional coaches or some other kind of school support, behavior, well, I guess they call them student success coaches, things like that. And I know a lot of our schools have that already, but are we helping to provide that so they can use their resources other ways? I don't know. I think it's a good discussion to have, and I love that we're having this one, the FTE, all of these now, because it's going to take time to figure out the exact direction we want to go, and as we're working on our strategic plan, but then hopefully by the end of this year, we'll have an idea for next year, and we'll be ready to be in place for all of that, and the schools know now that we're talking about it and can be ready.
Any other thoughts?
I would guess and venture to say that we're okay to go ahead and give the directive to go ahead and start exploring those options. I would say maybe we're anxious and excited to see what you come up with. Okay. Everyone feel good about that? Okay, great.
Okay, I'm done.
All right.
Tried to make up some time.
You did. Actually, well, you're not done. Moving
on
to
dang it.
moving.
I thought I was done, but now
psych. Here we go. Yeah. Now we're not very far behind, but the strategic plan update, that is also you, Wendy.
Excellent. So I sent out a strategic plan update earlier. I just wanted it kind of more entered into the record so that people kind of knew what was going on. The board members have all submitted names, so that was super helpful. We did meet as a cabinet and started to identify the individuals that we are going to extend invitations to. I'm just waiting for your names, Rebecca.
I'm so sorry. I swear I cannot keep that one top of mind, and I don't know why.
So we'll get Rebecca's names, and then in addition to that, we will also leadership kind of looking to make sure we have different employee groups that are represented, as well as certain individuals with cabinet. We do not want to overload it with district leadership, however. So we'll get all of that finalized, and those invitations will go out at the beginning of next week. I'll send you a list over this weekend of who our anticipated individuals are, and then who our alternates will be if those individuals cannot attend those meetings. And we have established when those meetings are. I'm trying to find my document that has the dates on it. It's in my shared drive of my many things, all of my things.
I've got it. Do you want me to read it?
Yeah. So I worked with a consultant with Insight. So those dates will be October 17th, November 7th, December 5th, January 16th, February 20th, and March 19th. And then they will have 3 work sessions for the entire board. October 24th and November 14th have been identified as those work sessions. Those will be 2 hours just dedicated to the strategic plan itself. And then they don't want to choose the last date of that work session because they'll draft some things and then they're going to take that out into some focus groups. So there will be at least one, and I'm pushing for 2 opportunities for the public to have time to get their eyes on it, and then they'll be able to come in and ask questions and provide feedback, and we could have a dialogue about that. And then they're also going to conduct a stakeholder survey. So they'll send that out and do a survey that actually will be coming in November. And so they'll use that survey data as well as the steering committee to start crafting our portrait of a graduate and our vision, mission, and goals, and then eventually the whole strategic plan. So and then our goal is to have this approved by April 16th. So that is the timeline. I do meet with the Insight person every Friday at 7:30 in the morning. And so if there are any questions or things that come up, you can just let me know. And they're really willing to do anything and everything. And they're going to give us on the focus groups an option to, I believe, also do that via Zoom. So people who might not be able to come in person to participate in those focus groups via Zoom if that's more helpful and would include more people, which I think it probably would. So
Have they found those to be equally beneficial when people are on Zoom versus together on that steering committee?
Well, so the steering committee will all be in person.
Oh, okay.
It will only
sorry.
be for it will only be for the focus groups.
Okay,
And we can determine if like one is on Zoom and then one is in person, for example, or if we want to do a combination of Zoom and in person for both of them. We can really kind of decide that once it gets closer. Those focus groups won't happen until after January. So other questions that you have? I'm just really excited about it, in case you can't tell.
Just a quick note for, maybe not, actually never mind.
Okay. Anything else? Then I think I made up all of my time.
Actually, we are ahead of the game. So that means it's going to extend our break just a little bit. We're going to break now until 10:30. So we have just a little over 15 minutes.
Perfect.
Team. Go fight win.
break, we're gonna go ahead and continue our study session. We're gonna go ahead and proceed to item number 10 on our agenda, the DLI discussion, and we'll give that time over to both Derek and Wendy.
Okay. Will you pull open that file that's attached? Okay, thank you. Okay, so what you see here is this is hot off the press in terms of breaking down our FTEs in the schools for the district allocated FTEs. Okay, so what you see here is this is typically our staffing ratio. Okay, so you've got the 27.5 over there on the side for the elementaries. And then you've got the projected enrollment versus what the current enrollment, right? And then you've got the above and below what was projected, okay? So then it says, okay, this is how many FTEs they are currently allocated based off of that staffing ratio, okay? So it's just a straight flat calculation. A divided by B equals C, right? So then what happens is at the during the springtime, as we're fleshing these out and they're preparing for things, schools will come in and make requests or asks for additional FTEs based off of what their enrollments are. And so what you see here is that column right there is those extra FTEs that have been allocated based off of those requests. Okay, and what I want to highlight is the ones that are kind of that darker color, well, maybe it'd be lighter, it's more of a brownish color on the projection, is the DLI FTEs. Those are specifically FTEs that they're requesting to try to make it to where they can handle class sizes that they feel are equitable. The Amelia Earhart one was due to some confusion around the all-day kindergarten, so that's why they were granted that one extra FTE. Franklin, the 2 extra FTEs that they have got has been authorized by the board. That was the small schools model that we said we will not go below this number of FTEs because they're a small school. And then the 2 in yellow are the gifted CASP FTEs that they're allocated, okay? And so what you see there is it's 16.5 FTEs that are being allocated above and beyond what a standard allocation model would be just due to DLI, okay? So the cost on that is about $1.7 million to get to that point, okay? So what questions do you have? We're going to open it up right at this point. What questions do you have around this information right here?
Okay, this may be a dumb question. So if I'm just looking at, let's take Timpanogos, what this is saying that they're requesting 7 more FTEs than what they.
Timpanogos.
Or 3. Oh, I see. Got it.
3, yeah.
It's just the above projected enrollment in the original. No question.
Yep.
Okay, so this is for this year.
This is this year's.
Do we know, is this pretty consistent for these schools? Is this the same allotment we give them extra every year?
It's about the same every year. So, I mean, because that's what those extra amounts are about the same. They fluctuate because it's looked at, but I mean, based on just where their enrollments are, that's about what they're needing just to keep those programs and have class sizes be where they're at.
So an extra column that would be helpful to me would be you have teacher staffing ratio, but with the new allocation, what is the new teacher staffing ratio with that allocation? I could easily go in and do
You're saying what's the class size? So I actually have got all the class sizes. We're going to go into some of these class sizes in Domo because I've got all the class sizes by school, by class in Domo.
Because obviously some of these schools are going to be not 27.5 ratio. It's going to be a lot lower.
And most
Yeah.
of our schools are not at the 27 and a half. There's only, in reality, as an average, every school is below it. There's only some classes that are above that.
Right, but some of these classes are going to be well below that.
Correct. We have classes that are in the teens.
So.
Okay, and then we are looking at this in particular because we are trying to notice this note number 1, that DLI schools have 16 and a half extra FTEs, right? That's the point we're trying to get out of this.
Correct.
Is that
and that is
those
just
schools
due to
in
the
particular?
current model that we run, right? With them being at these individual locations, right? So and there's a reason why some of our neighboring districts are moving to a magnet school, right? Is because what happens is by combining these down, and I'll pull it up here in a second because let me project.
If I can ask one more question while you're looking at that.
Yep.
The note number 2 is that this table only reflects contract teacher FTEs. What about FTEs that are brought in via like trust land money or TSSA money, stuff like, does it include that as well?
So there is a discretionary money also that is not included in here, okay? So there's other FTEs that that the schools do have and allocate that you see through their class sizes that are not here. This is essentially the district allocation that we've sat down and said, you cover it and we will support you if you don't have the funds to cover them.
A couple thoughts that came to my mind. As I just went through Derek's model, Derek's information, and took the column that says current enrollment, and then the final column that said total certified FTEs, and just, did that math quickly. Looking at that, and then in the context of what Wendy already was talking to about kind of a model, an equity model around allocating, I think this has to be folded into that, because that's why one of those columns needs to be DLI. If we're going to run DLI, we can't say, well, you'll have to fund some of your FTEs to actually have 2 classes because you're DLI if our district is going to support DLI, right? But the flip side of that is there are other things that need to be supported that aren't as clear as these are our immersion students in this language and they need X at some of our more impacted schools in other ways, right? So I think this is important to put into one of those columns to look at and see, and then to say, if we do run a model like that, is this weighted correctly for DLI or not? And would it allow a school to run a program without funding it themselves? Does that make sense? Like, are we funding the program we're saying that they're running or not? And then that could be used as we're making decisions around priorities.
Thank you. And so what you see here too is this is a breakout down by the number of students in each program, okay? So our Chinese program is 335 students, our Portuguese is 288, the gifted and talented is 149, Spanish is 577, and French is 276, okay? And this is just in the elementary level.
Wait, sorry, GT stands for?
Gifted and talented.
Gifted and talented, thank you.
Yep.
Wait, why are we including that with the language?
CAS.
They get extra FTEs for those.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So that is the essentially breakdown by so in saying that is we're depending on what the decisions are in the future, you can now see kind of how this could align or how things would work. Okay. There's another one I've got. Let me pull it up, which is this is class sizes, okay? So as you go into class sizes, this is, we're gonna go to, this one's Amelia Earhart, okay? So Amelia Earhart currently right now in first grade is 18, 18, and 20, right? Their second grade is 15, 16, 16. These are not DLIs, right? This is not a DLI school. Third grade, 20, 19, 21. 22, 20, or sorry, yeah, 22, 22, and then 21, 22, 21. Right, the structured class is those CAS students. That's what that means, okay? And then up here is the sixth.
Structured class would be a their behavior units and different.
Okay, so let me see what the name of the CAS ones was, because I may be mixing them.
Sunset View or probably.
Okay, thank you, because we had it named like that, and so let me pull it up. GT, that's what it is. All right, so there's your GT. Sorry, my apologies. But so here is now let's go up to Edgemont, right? So we'll just go to Edgemont. So Edgemont, here's your first grade DLI 23, 24, your standard grade 15, 20, second grade DLI 28, regular 24, 23, DLI 27 on second grade. Wait a second. We've got, that's what happened. There was a naming convention that changed and broke it out. So you got those two classes. And you got third grade is 18, 20 versus 16 and 16. Okay? And so you can see that it starts to flesh out that there are things that have to be done to try to drop down the population due to some of these. But this now has all of our classes and the number of students in every class in our elementaries, okay? Broken out by DLI, gifted and talented, and traditional, along with the number of full-day kindergarten students, along with your half-day kindergarten students, okay? If we move on over to Franklin, okay, Franklin is not a DLI school, and here's where they're sitting at. You've got your kindergartens that are in the 20s, first grades are low 20s, second grades in the teens, third grades up to almost 30, fourth grade is in the low 20s, fifth grade is in the teens, sixth grade is low 20s. Okay, Lakeview, what you see here again is first grade, mid-20s, the DLI, you got a 20 and a 24, second grade DLI, 24, 22, second grade, 24, 22, third grade, 30, 31, DLI, 27, 28, fourth grade, 26, 27, the DLI, fourth grade, 25, 25, fifth grade DLI, 22, what's that one? It's just not showing up because the color, yeah, there it is. Fifth grade, 22, 23, sixth grade, regular, 30, 31, 32, and then 24, 24 for the DLI. Yep, Canyon Crest is, so you got your kindergarten is sitting in the 21, 26, and 22. First grade, just the single class, not DLI, 12. First grade DLI, 28, 28. Second grade, 25, the DLI, 30, 31. Third grade, non-DLI, 17. Third grade DLI, 27, 25. Fourth grade DLI is 22, 22. Fourth grade non-DLI is 26. Fifth grade non-DLI is 25. Fifth grade DLI is 16 and 16. Sixth grade non-DLI 23. Sixth grade DLI 19 and 21. So as you can see, it just creates, it makes it very difficult to level your class sizes when you're dealing with these types of issues, right? And so it ends up costing us more to do these things. Now, if the taxpayers want it that way and support it that way, not a big deal. It's just that's a communication that we have to, be able to communicate that with them. as to the reason why some of these things are, and the added cost that is due to some of these, you're right, due to some of these things. What questions do you have up to this point?
How many students are transferring into DLI schools for DLI?
A lot. We do have that. I'd have to dig for that one where it's at right now, but I know we do have Wasatch that is greater than 50%.
Are they coming from our district or other districts?
Yeah, mostly in our district.
Okay.
I'm assuming that creates problems for numbers.
Yes,
For understanding like what first grade's gonna look like at each school the following year, because you don't know who's going in which direction either.
Yes, it creates numerous issues on numerous fronts, right? With the high degree of mobility and how close in proximity these are, and how much they do transfer, projections, while we have been close, as you saw on that other sheet, it makes it more difficult to project. The other thing it makes it really complicated is trying to redraw school boundaries, okay? Because we can be trying to redraw school boundaries, but when over half the school is saying, I'm just gonna come here no matter what, it really doesn't matter what boundaries you redraw at that point, right? And so it makes it difficult to try to redraw boundaries even to level these schools.
And I think that's a great point, Derek. You have to lay over this conversation that this is just a form of school choice. And school choice is based on the premise if you've got buildings with classrooms that are available, that they're open to anyone to within the state to attend, particularly if they make the early enrollment deadline, which starts here in about a month or two. So the issue of school boundaries is really interesting to lay in there. Having run a couple of, as a principal, 2 different DLI schools, it's also important to note that you just can't assume that the students, if they didn't have the DLI choice, that they would remain within public school. Having been in 2 different spots where we increased enrollment at our school, we also did track some of those numbers, and they were students who were opting not to participate in public school, but it brought them back to public school. So you have to kind of weigh that as a cost, is that individuals will perhaps seek other options away from the school district if perhaps those programs are in play. I don't have a number to that, but just anecdotally, I'd say that was a lot of people who reported. We used to be the charter school, we used to do homeschool, we used to go to a private school, but since you have this offering, we've come back to the public schools. That's a common sentiment in some of the neighborhoods.
An interesting thing I would think would be is if it's choicing in, how many of these kids are choicing in are low income? Like, does that make sense?
Yep. And you're saying from outside our district, or just
even inside the district? Because if you're choicing in, we're not offering busing to have you come do these programs. So you have to have a parent that's willing to drive you to do these programs. And usually a low-income family is not going to have those opportunities to come and do these type of things.
Good point. Very good point.
I will say that some of the lower income schools who have DLI programs benefit from that, because it kind of varies the population and gives people different.
But I would like to see where that breakdown is versus like, Canyon Crest versus Timpanogos.
Right. Because
they're both Spanish DLI, but who's opting in?
Yep, I agree. I also he's calling me. There's at least one, I think it's one that is a it's just as helpful for our Spanish. It's just as beneficial for our, or even maybe more beneficial for our English learners as it is for our Spanish learners. I know at Timpanogos, which is the school that I live down the street from, that I think it's like they do the dual, I don't know what I'm talking about, but the two-way, right? And so we have kids learning Spanish, but we also have an almost equal, I don't know I shouldn't say that, just we have a number of kids learning English, and it's been very helpful for them. And so as I'm thinking about our conversations from earlier this morning, I think maybe the FTEs are helpful there, right? Because we have some of these English learners that are in part of the formulas and things like that where this is helpful. However, I do see the inconsistencies and it does make me cringe just a little bit.
Okay.
Well, a couple of things. So first of all, just looking at some of these examples is very helpful. But it makes me question, and again, this will go back to being more strategic in how we allot our teachers, but, you know, why does one grade level get 16 in each class instead of just having, at an older grade, having a class of 32, which we do sometimes, right? So there's some questions about things like that, right?
I can give you examples
go ahead.
specific to that.
Yes.
So we've decided to have at least 2 classes of dual language immersion on each grade. That's a part of our policy. And so with that, even though it's 15 and 16, he can't then combine it to 31 and move the other FTE down to the lower grade to make it smaller. So we have a lot of mixed practices that put people in these places. And so they're trying to be strategic. Some of the other things you see, and Derek did a good job of showing this, is that principals have discretionary budget and they often try to do what you described, where they put as much into the lower end of the kinder through 2nd grades to divide them out as much as possible. Once it does get to those tricky numbers like 31, that's when we start helping them with instructional assistance. But if they choose to split the class again because of money they have at that site, it's their decision. But one of the reasons why he kind of got pinned into not making that decision is what I described of you have to have at least 2 of the Spanish classes, and that makes them 15 and 16 on the upper grades.
So is that a policy that comes from the board that we need to look at?
Well, yes, it isn't in the policy. The other part of that is we worked with Canyon Crest specifically because we were trying to change the numbers of the school overall. And one of the things that the parents asked for at the time was a guarantee of having 2 classes. And so, again, I think there's parts of this where I think we're all trying to solve the problem. The problem's a little different at each school.
Yes.
But district-wide, is it a policy that a DLI program has
have at
2
least 2 of the language classes.
even if there's 1 of the English class?
Yeah, because population.
Yeah, I sometimes you just get what you get. We've been able to support at least 2 classes. There's been times though we've ended up with an odd number. There was times that when I was at Edgemont, we had 3 classes, and so we'd have 2 half-time teachers splitting the half day. But as far as having a spot where there was just 1 versus 2, that's very rare because I think our demand has been to at least have 2 sections. Also, it's important to note, and some of the numbers that Derek showed us, like the Canyon Crest model shows, that DLI programs do staff heavy, are populated heavy by lots of students in the first, through 2nd, 3rd grades, and again, just that natural, attrition thing. That's what I'm looking for. That by the time, and Canyon Crest showed this, they were low 20s or high teens by the time we were 6th grade. But your average you're shooting for is to get to that middle spot. That the program by itself is self-funded as best you can, to say that you're in that sweet spot of 25, 26 is your average, closer to what your FTE allotment is. So, but it by design has to be higher class sizes, and when we do the selection process in student services, our target is to up to 30 in 1st grade for starting the school year in 1st grade, and then that cohort group tends to, as you saw in the numbers, slowly begin to dwindle by the time they get into 5th and 6th grade.
Well, I understand why there's a guarantee in place, and yet I don't know. I think maybe we need to look at how we do that, because in this specific example, like if we could take one of those FTEs from the 5th grade DLI, have that 5th grade be a little bit larger class, and make that 2nd grade DLI have 3 sessions, so we can really focus on math and reading skills for our younger students with a smaller class size. Like, I think there could be a lot of benefit to that, right? So I think we've got to find a way to have a policy that gives enough flexibility to meet our students' needs. So that's just one thing, I think, because I think our purpose today is kind of to get some information and then to also say what other information do we want as we're looking at our DLI programs and evaluating their effectiveness and whether we continue exactly as they are or make some adjustments. Some data I would like to see is very specifically those who are currently enrolled in our DLI and maybe some trends over time. How many of them are families that are just going to their boundary school and are like, oh, this isn't my boundary school, I'll go ahead and take advantage of this program, versus, hey, this language is really important to me and I'm willing to drive my students somewhere. I think that's, and maybe at some point we could get to surveys to really ask the specific people, but I think starting with a little bit of that data would help us understand if we were to make adjustments, how numbers could be affected by that.
Something I would like to see followed up too at the DLI is, so they get done with DLI in 6th grade, how many of them are participating in our secondary, because that's another additional cost that we have to talk about, because that was something that we were guaranteeing with this program, that they would get it all the way through high school. And how many of this cohort how much is that costing us even at the secondary level?
I'm super interested in knowing data from other districts who have changed their DLI program into a magnet school and how that affected enrollment in DLI when they moved it to a central location, and pros and cons, and I don't know, any kind of analysis that districts have from moving to a magnet program.
Do we know of districts that have done that?
Well, I heard that Alpine just voted to do that. Can anybody confirm that?
They voted to it, but they paused it.
But they paused
what
it.
I've heard because
okay.
of
I have a feeling some district out there somewhere.
Salt Lake, I believe, has one.
We're really unique because we have a lot of DLI schools for the size of what
Tooele is the same.
Tooele
has more than we do. They have
Tooele
German.
does?
No, do we have German? They have additional.
So yeah, I'd be curious to see what maybe
And they're having
doing.
the same problem.
And Wasatch and Park City, I think every elementary school is a DLI school, though I think they just single it down to a single language district-wide.
One language district-wide, okay. Okay.
Because I think Box Elder is only Chinese. I don't think they have any other DLI.
Okay.
I have heard, just again, when you say schools that are trying to address these issues, I think Granite School District maybe looked to close a DLI school. I don't know that it was maybe it was combined with another, or the idea of a magnet school was first, I think, something I've heard in concept for a long time. We've talked for some time, Anne-Marie, about the benefits of creating DLI specific schools. But I think Alpine's the first I've heard that launched that idea, but again, I think seems to have it on hold. But I've heard that maybe Granite School District, who had a lot of early implementers, has looked to maybe eliminate the program and begin to phase it out in some of their elementary schools.
Jennifer? I have one more thing I want to ask for. This feels way bigger to ask for, sorry, in advance. I am so interested to know, and this might take forever to figure out, but how much money is actually spent on a DLI child versus an English child, and what the difference is. And I mean, we kind of need to look at the equity of that, I think. And I, in my mind, it feels like we're spending more on a DLI child. I want to know if that's true, and if so, how big is the difference?
I'd love to see that, not just here, but nationwide, if the information is available.
You can't pull it out.
Right, that's why I know that's kind of a big
so
request.
and that was going to be my ask on this, is because this can be looked at in a couple different ways. So because if we have, say, a teacher who's later in their career who's wanted to stick around at that school, and it's a DLI school and whatnot, that is going to intrinsically show that they're higher cost, just due to the fact that that teacher's wage is higher versus, say, another one, a school that maybe, let's say Franklin, that has maybe newer teachers. It will show that, if that wage is low, that the class sizes may be the exact same number of students, but the DLI will show higher just due to that cost of the teacher's salary being higher. If that is,
But that I was
And
going to
that's
say
what's-
that
and I
is
was
what we
gonna
were just talking about,
bingo.
right? That is a benefit.
And I was gonna say, if you're okay with that, because of that, then it'll be very easy to calculate this, right? But
Well,
that was just one thing I wanted to make sure was pointed out.
I'm okay with that. I'm also have been told that like DLI teachers have to have, most of the time come from out of the country and have to have special licenses or special visas, and there's lots of things that the district will participate in. Good catch.
Good catch.
Like helping to get those teachers here, right? So like it just seems like there's quite a bit of extra cost associated with the program. So if there's a way to actually like, which I think
We can
it's
do
just
it.
a lot of work.
Yeah.
I would like to see that.
Can I, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, and then Melanie after Jennifer.
Okay.
Something else I would like to see is the academic data, the achievement, both on core subjects like their proficiency in reading, in math. I actually had a community member who does math tutoring reach out to me this week and told me all of her clients are DLI students that just are struggling with math concepts because it's hard for them to grasp it when they're learning it in that target language. That's anecdotal. I would like to see what the data is across, elementary all the way up through secondary, as well as kind of what Melanie was saying earlier, like what is the data on their proficiency of that target language? How much do they stick with it? How many of them are taking the AP test? And what are their scores? And all of those kinds of things are important factors. The money is important, but if we're getting good results with it, we could decide, hey, it's worth the money, right? So I would like to see what our results are on that.
Something I would like to see broken down too, we should be able to get this information though, is in a DLI class, how many ELL students are in there? How many SPED kids are in each of these different classes? My guess is that the general ed class, they're going to be much higher than their cohort. And that's going to be an inequity that's happening as well.
You guys have a lot of work cut out for you.
We already knew that. One of the other things I think would be helpful is looking at how many of our students through DLA actually earn the seal of biliteracy, how many are actually graduating with the number of hours that makes it so they almost have a minor in that language. And then there's Apple data that shows the proficiency in the language at every single year. So looking at the effectiveness of each of our programs in the languages, and we could compare that with state averages as well. I think those would all be important data pieces to gather.
Wendy, I can say I'm in the DLI Spanish. I can tell you that my original elementary school class of about 30 kids has whittled down to about 12 students in my senior year. So like definitely people leave, especially when you get to that bridge level and then getting that seal by literacy.
So Anne Marie had a comment too, and then we'll go to Meg.
One perhaps hopeful note is in the last state board meeting, they identified 4 legislative priorities for the coming year. One of those is DLI. So I do think these conversations are happening around the state as the DLI program is at this stage quite developed, and we're seeing more of the challenges. So something to watch for.
Thank you. Meg?
Will, as you were talking, I do know like at Provo High it's come up for me because my daughter did do Spanish, but there is no bridge program in Spanish at Provo High.
We're working on it.
Okay.
Yeah. I about lost my mind when I found that out.
Okay. I know I've asked Jared a little bit about it, but my daughter's experience is the same. Her cohort has shrunk as she's gone through. But I do think if we're thinking about the community though, and I'm specifically right now thinking about Wasatch and their Chinese program, and there is just a lot of culture around that, and I do think people sending their kids to dual immersion programs isn't, whether this is right or wrong, or it's not necessarily right or wrong, but it's not always about proficiency. I do think there are some other values around dual language, right, and exposure and cultural, and so I just think these are conversations we continue to have with the community, right? Because I think if I were to talk to some Wasatch parents and families, their value set coming to this program maybe are different than what we're talking about right now. Not that that needs to be the only thing guiding our decisions, but just part of the conversation.
Those are important, for sure.
I think it would be really interesting to compare the spending per student for a multilingual student versus a DLI Spanish student in particular, because we tend to view dual immersion as being something that is very much an asset, and we tend to view, if I'm an ML student, I'm an English learner, it's seen as that is a challenge or a burden to the school to handle that, and they really should be treated the same, because the goal is that both of these types of students are coming out with proficiency in 2 languages, and they should both be seen as an asset. So it will be really important to see if there's an opportunity gap that's existing, because if that is the case, then we need to figure out how to close that. We also need to recognize that in pulling numbers per student, some students do cost more to educate, and it's okay. And so we don't want to, examine a program or a methodology or whatever purely based on that. It is a data point. It probably isn't the deciding data point. So I just wanted to make note of that.
For sure. Go ahead, Jennifer.
I just want to ask Anne Marie if you have any more clarification or details on what you just shared about what that means, that it's going to be a priority. Like, are they thinking they need more money, more support, a different way of structuring the program, or is it just way open right now till they talk more?
Well, given that it's a legislative priority, that usually means money. I mean, I think that they're seeing that if we were to look at the Utah DLI model, they would say it pays for itself. I mean, we might look at those students at Canyon Crest and say there are 26 in one and 14 in one, so those students are there, it's paying for itself. But there are these unintended costs. The state pays for the curriculum for DLI programs. They pay for training for teachers and principals in those DLI programs. But I do think that these challenges are coming up statewide. So when I hear a legislative priority, I hear money. They want, I'm assuming they're asking for an increase in that.
I just want to clarify, I just did review the policy. There is an expectation to have similar class numbers on the grade, but there's not a specific one to say you have to have a minimum of 2. So I did review it. It's not explicit in the policy, and I just wanted to make that clear. Most principals have that expectation, because without that, they don't have the opportunity to potentially have a student choose to move to another class if there's a difficulty. So that has been kind of a standard practice, but not a policy.
That's also, go ahead.
Take it away.
Well, that's also what we're experiencing, though, when we end up with only one English class, is that exact problem on the opposite side, right?
Right,
So, yeah.
exactly.
Meg?
And this may be kind of adjacent, but I do, in talking with friends who teach at the McKay School of Education that do focus on DLI, I think that there are concerns about the Utah model and the approach, and I think it actually goes to what you're speaking to, Wendy, right? You look at dual language as like this kind of maybe focusing more, if I dare say, affluent kids, right? Like, oh, this is an asset, at the expense of, wait, actually, maybe our dual programs should be really targeted at our multi-language learners, right? Like, and really highlighting this, that they can speak 2 languages. So I guess I'm curious if there is an option to explore not doing the Utah model, which then I know is tied to funding, money, resources, and that's probably the answer. But I guess if we're looking at outcomes and wanting to see if the program itself, the way we run it, is already deficit and giving us better outcomes, it'd be great to collaborate even with folks up at BYU, that do this, like, hey, what is a better way if we want to do a DLI program? Is there a better way? But
So that's what Timpanogos is doing, right?
Sure,
So
yes.
we're already running one of those non-Utah models on our own, right? So
and I think that's tied to why we don't have Bridge at Provo High.
which might be another good data point to look at, the differences we get from Timpanogos versus Canyon Crest, perhaps, when one is using the state model and one's not.
Well, and I think what we would have to do in that is you would need to look at, in particular, a multilingual learner at Canyon Crest, even if they're not in the DLI if they are in the DLI program, that's amazing. But even look at their proficiency rates versus those at Timpanogos, because nationwide, the research shows that students that are in this non-Utah state model, where it really is kind of to what Gina was describing, where it's going two ways, our multilingual students do much better in acquiring both English and higher levels of proficiency in their native language. This is something like West Ed, for example, has done a ton of research on, and if you go to their conferences about educating multilingual learners, they actually state that true immersion programs are the best way to educate them, but it is this more of this Timpanogos model than it is what the state traditionally has done.
I think it's like called translanguaging,
yes,
right? You're not like
yeah.
saying you have to only talk and speak in this target language. You realize that you have two languages coming that are targeting.
We should note that the state model does allow, I mean, it knows that there are single language learners learning acquiring a second language. There is a two-way immersion within it too. There are lots of details as to, I think, why Timpanogos chose the direction it went. I think as we think about this, Spanish is certainly a language that we're working with we have a lot of native Spanish speakers. I wouldn't forget Portuguese. We've got lots of Portuguese-speaking immigrants, Brazilian immigrants, and Lakeview is our largest elementary, I believe, still, and it's drawing a lot of students in either heritage language or native language students. So we have a couple of languages that are not I don't want to use the word elitist, but I'm going to throw it in, sometimes perceived as elitist languages.
Melanie?
I know at one point we were basically seeing two classes inside the schools of these DLI schools. We had the DLI kids and the non-DLI kids. Are we still seeing that there's not much integration with these kids? I know that we were trying to bring STEAM and STEM into the classes. I mean, it would be a good follow-up to see like how much integration are these students having with each other, with the non-DLI and the DLI together.
Do you have a sense of that, Jared?
Not as close as I would like, but there, as you've described, Melanie, there's been this evolution of some other type of a program, whether it's STEAM, STEM, and that's been to address that concern. But there really is still a mindset that DLI is different, and though there's been efforts to do so, there's still sort of a separation that's hard to separate from.
Well, and anecdotally, just from like parents in my neighborhood who've talked with me, even if we level sort of the perception or distinction in our groups, what has been hard, and I do think our principals are working on this, is, to your point, bringing our kids together when they're on the playground or when they're doing something else. Are they like, well, he's a Spanish kid, or they're not, they're an English kid? Like, do they see a divide between the student body? And that's not necessarily, it's just a thing to be aware. I think our principals are working hard, I feel like, to build school collaboration between, but there is a divide that they see coming into the middle schools, right, of kids knowing each other based on which track they've been in. And one thing that came to mind when you were talking about math and DLI was thinking about our multilingual students who do math and English, not in their primary language, right? So, I mean, these are all good questions and conversations to have, but there are challenges all around it, I think.
Will, you had a comment, and then did you too, Gina? You can. Okay, and then Terry. We'll go Will and Terry.
I mean, my experience in elementary school with that was, there was a very real divide between the only English students and then the DLI, and we just didn't see each other. I remember a few times we do like STEM stuff combined with all 3 classes, and that was the only time we'd see each other, and we just wouldn't really interact beyond that. So I think there's a lot to be said for how can we bring in STEAM and DLI students, how can they do things together, because then going to middle school,
having the CAS program, to integrate, they have the 3, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade teachers share science. So the kids go to specific and they divide them out. You know, the CAS kids don't go to a specific teacher. They separate all the kids. And their RISE scores in science are amazing compared to their English and math class scores. So that we just talked about it in the last community council meeting, and so that was amazing to me.
Okay. It's 11:16. We have another 15, 11:15. We have another 15 minutes allotted to discuss this, but we've had some great discussions so far. So we can keep going if there's still more comments and questions.
I just have another question.
Yeah.
So for the schools that do have like the DLI and they are doing like the STEAM or the STEM, like Wasatch, Edgemont, I'm curious how that, I guess, how are they funding those? You know, as I'm thinking about all of our schools and how every school, right, is trying to attract enrollment, right? Like how do we bring kids here? And so I'm curious how a school is doing DLI and a STEM program.
Versus one that just has DLI and English.
Yeah, or you know, ones that don't have either.
English.
Yeah.
Right.
And maybe this is a conversation for a different time. This is just me being ignorant to how that kind of stuff works. So.
Doug has a lot of history on that, having done that at Edgemont. Just saying.
And it might be one of the reasons when you see the schools that have some supplemental FTEs that Derek pointed out, Edgemont has 3 or 4 additional FTEs. And that could be part of it. Not that it requires additional staffing to run those programs, it requires additional professional development. And we tapped into, and Edgemont has a history of being also an art school. That's why not just STEM, but STEAM made sense to us. So the Beverly Taylor Sorensen Foundation was helpful in supporting some of that with a little bit of staffing, but a lot of professional development and help. We also entered into a partnership with the BYU Department of Education and their engineering department. And in other words, we just made it a professional development priority that everyone who is teaching DLI or non-DLI was all trained in the aspects of curriculum integration and inquiry models of instruction, the engineering process. And so in other words, it just became something you worked with the staff you had and provided them some direction and some support to be able to teach that way that was more integrated and hands-on and so forth. So, and I hate to say that it's sometimes banners and lanyards, but sometimes a little bit of it is just what you sell to your community that you're doing. And that was a big emphasis for me at Edgemont, is that when I arrived there, it was a little bit what the Canyon Crest model is of 1 English class and 2 DLI classes, and anyone who didn't make it in or moved in, mobility is what you'll get in those other classes. I think it was to what was said by Melanie earlier. If you entered in after the original 1st grade cohort, they worked really hard to get to one of the neighboring schools because they felt like they had missed the opportunity to join that program. So the idea of creating this idea of that you're still a winner as a student or as a parent, no matter when you come into the school, and there's something that's of value, or of even, again, I hate to say it this way, but everyone likes to feel that they're getting basic plus. And that Edgemont community really spoke to them, and we're able to essentially have the 2 and 2. So in other words, a 4 grade level per 4 classes per grade level cohort's been intact now for about a decade since we started some of that effort to build that sort of a professional development and instructional model at Edgemont.
Thank you. What were you going to say?
I was just going to go back more to the financial portion of it. The superintendent has had a budget that they have discretion over, and in the past, a lot of the space labs and those types of things were supported by the superintendent doing a one-time purchase to get things all set up and taken care of. And then that way you could move on into the staffing portion from the school based on what your allocation was. So there was work both ways to try to support this idea that Doug just was describing of helping people feel like if you didn't get into the DLI program, you weren't in the winning group.
I do have a question, maybe Anne-Marie knows the answer to this. I know when I've gone to state Audi trainings before, they have really touted that students in Spanish DLI are outperforming their peers, and college credits earned and that type of thing. Are we seeing those same numbers in our district? Is it reflecting in the same way? Because I know like Chinese, they weren't having as much, their proficiency levels, for example, were high, but not in terms of their language proficiency, right? Then those numbers were lower, and what sense can we make of that data, or do we need to look at that again more thoroughly?
I think we need to look at it with some specific questions. I have impressions, but I don't want to speak on impressions right now on that.
Okay.
Meg, were you just raising your hand?
No, but I think that did make me think kind of back to that value question, right? Like these kids, like in Chinese, right, they're proficient in their core classes, but maybe not as much in the language, right, is what you're kind of getting at. That still just may be the value of the exposure to the language for some of these families is valuable, right? And so what are people's goals? Is it absolute proficiency in this additional language, or is it some other aspects too? So
I have all of our DLI programs and even CAS programs, have they all gone through and we've got graduates, like they've all graduated, had a graduating class, so they started in first grade and they've all graduated? Is there any way we could survey parents of kids who have graduated and gone through this whole thing to see if they had a choice, would they do it again? Do you see what I'm asking? I don't even know if that's even possible because their kids are graduated now, but to see if I had a choice to go back and start my kid again in first grade, would I do that same track?
Well, and is my kid still using that language?
Right.
Like, that's also really powerful too. Like, you know, but then goes back to Meg's point. Is that really what what is the objective of the parent? Is it just that my child is fluent in two languages and we're going to use those two languages, or is it just that they're getting an exposure and an appreciation, at least some understanding? Like, I think that's also quite varied, right? We would need to survey parents about what do you feel is the most important objective as part of this. I know from the teacher side that I have been bombarded by teachers wanting DLI specific coaches and DLI specific professional learning. Those are the two things I get quite consistently, that their teachers are not feeling supported in that.
I think to those points about, the other objectives, I think those are very fair points and good things to ask. But once we get all that data back, we're going to have to decide. I mean, we've got 4 languages in a very small district. If we're not hitting maybe some of the more academic things, is the value on those other things worth it with all the costs and things associated? So I think it's all things to consider, but it might be important to some parents, some of those other values, but we have to decide as a district-wide what are our objectives out of these programs.
Jared?
I think as Derek began, he shared that we're contributing up to 16.5 additional FTEs at the elementary level. This is my understanding, we're not committing additional DLI FTEs to the secondary level, and principals are making it work within their master schedule, and perhaps that led to some variability in outcomes, right? And there's the DLI program with the assurances at the state level requires us to use their resources. And that in and of itself creates sort of a divide with collaboration among the teachers as well. We were in Wasatch this week in a Chinese class, and they're using a completely different math resource than the other teachers on that grade level. And that creates sort of a contrived collaboration effect, which sometimes contributes to that divide that we were describing before.
And this is anecdotal, but I have had, yes, we are, just as Jared pointed out, the secondaries are just kind of expected to figure it out. And that is also a pain point for our secondary, because I've had a secondary principal let me know that, they would use that FTE differently if they had the option.
Well, and a couple years ago, I remember sitting in on a meeting with district personnel as well as secondary administrators and parents to discuss whether or not, if we're committed to this, we're committed K through 12. And if we sell to the parents deciding to opt in a program, the district needs to support and fund the whole program and not only K through 8. That's just a decision we need to make.
Derek, can you help me understand how there are more FTEs going in the elementary? Because as I look at those numbers, they average.
I can speak to that. So we run our averages based on a student number for the school, and typically for the dual language immersion schools, we then have them have a follow-up with us where we have a conversation, and it comes back to exactly what we were talking about earlier. When you have a group of 31 or those types of things, and at a certain point Derek chooses to give them an additional FTE beyond their allotment, their base allotment, and that happens quite frequently. Year over year, we're giving out more based on the fact that if all the students could fit in the 3 to 4 classes, there wouldn't be a need for that additional FTE. But because they're English on one side and the language on the other side, we're often having to look at how do we split that language group one more time.
I guess that Doug and I in the examples didn't see it. We saw like low class sizes at Amelia across the board, but in the others we saw it.
It's the additional pots of money.
And I think the other thing that we have to really keep in mind here, this goes back to the secondary portion too, is the variability of the student choosing to stay in the program once they get to the secondary program, because a lot more things are offered to students at that point, and even their parents say, yeah, I'm willing to let you choose something else at this point because now we have these greater offerings. But on the elementary side, the variability comes into play with the principal's choice. We give them a number of FTE, but we don't say it has to be this number on this grade. We allow them to try to do what we described earlier, which is really load the K through 2 as low as possible, and then that makes the higher classes at the second or 3rd through 6th, right? But principals know that there's a hard group potentially coming through on a specific grade, and then they split that group again. And even though the numbers don't warrant it necessarily, they need the help in doing it. And so there's a lot of variability in this. The other piece that I don't know that we can't mention is that we're talking a lot about the amount of dollars that we specifically give them for class size. And then there's this discretionary amount on top of that that principals have. They have, TSSA, they have trust lands, they have Title I, all these other things that they have an ability to do something with. And for most of those, not Title I, but most of those, they choose to then lower the class size by hiring additional teachers beyond what we've given to them. So that's where this variability comes in for the elementary schools, that principals have a lot of choice. And I'm not saying we should eliminate that. I just, even going back to the example of Canyon Crest, we really have to have a conversation with Sean to say, why did you choose to have this group have 15 and 16 and this group have 31? What was your reasoning specifically? Is it that this class grade is very difficult and we need to potentially have more classes there so we have options? So that's a lot of this that makes it kind of tricky.
Well, and sometimes we're forgetting that, and maybe this isn't the case in Canyon Crest, but students register, like sometimes at the last minute, and all of a sudden you'll get a bump of 7 students in a grade level, but you've already hired this teacher for this grade level. It's going to be hard for you to try to go convince that teacher now. Never mind. Now I'm gonna affect this grade level and push this grade level up to 30 or 31, and I'm gonna make a teacher move to another grade level to pull that number down. It really has to be extreme, I think, for a principal to do that, because the cost that would, the ask on that teacher, on those teachers, is a lot. So there's a lot that's impacting, the decisions that principals are making, and it's easy to say, well, with these numbers, why don't you do this? And it's like there's a lot of rationale and thoughtfulness that goes into it, and our principals belabor that and think about all of those things, but then sometimes they just get slammed with something at the last minute, so it's not controllable.
just want to echo what we talked about earlier. I think our commitment, so to speak, to having 2 DLI classes per grade level is creating these challenges. And as Jason pointed out in our policy, it doesn't state that we do that all the way through 6th grade. It does say in 1st grade, and whether that's just been replicated because of history, that's creating these challenges, especially through attrition by 6th grade. If 20% of the kids have left the program, then you may have inefficiencies with that DLI class size, and it puts a greater stress on the regular ed class size.
If that really is the case, we need to make sure our principals are aware of that, because if they have the ability to reduce down to 1 DLI class, like in a higher grade, then that ought to be utilized, right? Okay, it is 11:30 on the dot. So that is our hour. I feel like we have had a great discussion and we have come up with plenty of things to look for and do. And if we keep going, we're just going to give you more work. So I'm going to cut this one off. Okay, so let's move on to item number 11, which is revisiting school start times. So this we had as a follow-up item on our agenda tracking sheet as a continuing agenda item. We've discussed this, well, lots and lots of times, and I can tell you my history here of what I know since I've been on the board, but I know that in the past we have convened committees comprised of parents and teachers and district staff, and we have studied the issue of later school start times, and every time that's happened, we have determined maybe it's too costly, or maybe it's, we don't have enough transportation, but we've come up with determinations, and we've never taken the plunge or moved forward with anything. What we kind of talked about in our agenda planning meeting today, or to address today with start times for schools, is to possibly do the one thing, or to give a directive to Wendy and Derek to possibly do the one thing that we have not done yet when it comes to school start times, which is to actually survey the public and see what they really are interested in. But in doing so, we would make sure to be very clear that, it's not just, do you want to start school later, but it's, would you like to start school later with these consequences in mind? Right, here's the options. If we start school later for high schools, you need to know that either that means your elementary schools start earlier, or we raise property taxes to fund, to double our transportation fleet, or et cetera, right? And so we talked about maybe that's the next move that we want to do. I'm also curious to know from board members, how much are you still hearing about this from constituents? Because I personally still from time to time will receive an email, and people still, I do feel like it's top of mind for people. I do also want to caution us that this has potential to become extremely controversial, which we're not strangers to, so that's okay, but that's something, and I don't want us to avoid it because it will become controversial, but it can. So I think we just need to be very calculated and careful about how we go about this. But that's kind of what board leadership wanted to bring up today, and see how everyone feels about possibly doing that. Take comments, questions.
Can I add one more?
Yeah,
Is now the right time to have those discussions? Because we said we'd revisit it in a few months, so it's been that much time. Or do we still want to put it off and then discuss it when we've gotten through some of the other big topics we're talking about?
Because we are talking about a lot of other things. And strategic planning may influence it, right? There's a lot of things that may mean we want to look at this later. So I'm interested in everyone's thoughts, etc. So Gina.
I do think that we need to do something, because I don't get it as much. I'm not directly over a secondary school at the moment. I have more of the elementary concerns and some of the middle school concerns, but it is definitely something that the community talks about, and we should probably be a part of those discussions, right, rather than just on Facebook. But I also think that we have so much going on right now that we should not pick this up right now, but let the public know this is not, and I actually really love that this is on the agenda today, because I think it's demonstrating to the public that we had the discussion. We said we're going to have it again. We're having it again. We're not going to forget about this, but I feel like the more stuff we pick up, the less effective we're going to be with all of it, right? And I would like this to be an effective, really thoughtful discussion, and not that we can't do that, but I feel like we're, all y'all that work full-time here, I'm surprised you're still here, like we're overworking you. Thank you for staying. Thank you, Wendy, for not quitting in your first 2 weeks. but I want to have this discussion. I don't think now is the right time to do it. I think maybe looking at it, let's give the new superintendent a year, and then let's add to it. Is my opinion.
Okay. Melanie?
I think if we're going to survey, which I think is a great idea, I think who do we hear the most from about school start times? It's probably our secondary ed students, mostly parents in that direction. My daughter being one of them. Every morning when I have to go wake her up, she's even doing an early morning class, and it's really hard. And then she does volleyball on top of that, so her days are very, very long. However, if this isn't something we want to implement right now, for sure, definitely. But we need to, if we want to ask, we need to get that ball rolling, because this would need to take a year or two to get all the cogs in place to figure it out, if it's something we want to go with.
So you're saying go ahead and ask now, knowing that it's going to take a year anyways? Is that what you mean?
I think we need that information so that we can make plans to make the decisions that might take a year or two to get everything in place.
But it's going to take staff to get the survey out, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely think this is an issue that comes to me often, and just at our combined city council meeting, it came up there afterwards to asking me about this topic. I don't know what's involved in creating a survey that is going to yield reliable information and rolling that out, but I personally think the time to start is now, because I think it's going to take a while to, like, not like you're now going to get this survey in a month, but let's start putting these pieces together. There's just a lot of research out there around this issue, and we need to be responsive. I think the first committee that studied this here was more than 5 years ago. So, you know, people's resources have already gone towards this, and I just think I've lived where students do wait in the dark for bus stops in the cold, and they actually were okay. I mean, I'm not saying I think that we have to do one thing, but I just think we need to hear from people, and this is something we can be moving towards making a decision with. Obviously, we do need a strategic plan in place, because all of these are big decisions, but gathering this data to me feels timely and respectful of the community, because for me, I hear about it so often. But if it's not respectful of staff here and of the district, then I want to hear from people who would need to do that work to say, hey, we're also doing your strategic planning, and we're going to be surveying people for that, and they need to wait, then I'm fine with that. But if there are people able to do that now, then I would like to.
That was my comment. Just, if we're going to do a survey for the strategic plan in November, we need to then do this appropriately.
Right, so they're not the same
survey fee.
We don't want to like bombard the public survey after survey after survey, you know, and especially if there's going to be focus groups too, and we just need to do it at the appropriate time.
Well,
as a current high school student, I can tell you, I would like to sleep in a little bit. Like, it's sad when today I was like, I can sleep until 7. Like, that, and next week I have swim team starting, so I need to be at the rec center at 5:50 in the morning, and that's just, it's a lot, especially since there is a lot of research showing teens naturally will go to bed a lot later, that our natural cycle is just staying awake later, waking up later. So I would say move forward with the survey, because it doesn't hurt us right now to get more information. We can definitely look into more research, but I think if we do make a change, we should make the change as soon as possible.
There's no doubt of research. It's just whether or not we can make it
manage. So can I get a feeling of capacity right now? Like, we really are in, I mean, we just gave you about 800 directives on like just on DLI alone. So, and Caleb, I would guess you'd be heavily involved in the survey. So what does the capacity feel like? Is it a possibility now? Does it make more sense maybe even in January? Like, I mean, and keep in mind too, if we send the survey out in the dead of winter, we are going to get different results than if we do it right, like when because that will actually affect parents' views on it when their child is going to the bus stop at 6 a.m. and it is 2 degrees. So
So I just want to say a couple of things based on going through this process before. So first and foremost, Will, you're still going to have to be at swim practice at 5:50 in the morning because that's going to be when your rec center is available. So unless your school has its own pool, it won't matter. And so there are these conceptions that when school starts later, that there's all of these benefits. There is, except you're still going to end up having a lot of early morning things take place because a lot of your practices for teams will now shift to the morning because you won't have enough time in the hours after school to actually hold those practices before games happen. So coaches will just shift the practice. So volleyball practice won't be at 3 p.m. Volleyball practice will now be at 6 a.m. And now we've got to negotiate gym space. So it's not as simple as people think, like, oh, we're just going to switch this around. And our busing capacity is not such that we can bus everybody later. And in my experience, yes, the high schools always want to have a later start time, and I do not blame them, not at all. But in general, our elementary families don't want an earlier start time especially they're highly impacted because they are often relying on the older siblings. If you're in a more affluent area, yes, it's not a big deal. Mom or dad can get them to and from work, or they have other individuals they can rely on. So I don't think a survey is a big deal. I think a survey would be a really good idea to just ask the public, do you want us to study it? Just even ask that question before we put a ton of resources in it, and have them mark whether their child is elementary, middle, or high school. Do you want us to study this, understanding that it means that our elementary is going to flip to being the early start, so they're going to be starting on buses at between 6 and 6:30 in the morning, and our high schools would start later, and then get a feel for what we want. And Nate can help us develop that survey so it's scientific, and then Caleb and his team can help us get it out, and then Nate and Susie and those individuals would help us analyze that data. So we could make it very simple and keep it and do it pretty rapidly.
But that isn't our only option, right?
That's correct.
That's maybe the easiest option.
Yes.
And the least costly, but there is an option to somehow double our transportation fleet and start them all at the same time.
Yes.
There is more.
There's a
there
third
are,
option.
There are more options, right?
The other option we talked about was just moving everybody later.
Everybody down.
So like
15
elementary
minutes,
wouldn't get out till like 4:30 or something.
I don't mind, the directive to I don't mind saying, hey, do you want us to study this? But I think if we don't outline if we don't give any background information, everyone's going to say, sure, study it, right? But I think we do need to make it very clear that this that we're talking about, late school start times, is a literal system-wide change that has the potential to touch every piece of the school district. It's literally not just, like you say, it's not just switching times. It's every part of this school district is impacted in some way. And I don't know that people understand, especially when they email, because they always say, why can't we just? And just is one of my very favorite words, but we cannot just. It is a huge, huge system-wide disruptive change. So I would just want to make sure if we do that, we say, do you want us to study this? It would have to say, caveat, this means a huge, huge disruption to the district. Just so they understand that's what I think is lacking, is that information, right? And then, but also how do we really educate the public well enough so that they really understand? I don't know if you do that through a survey, or I don't know the best way to do that either, right? So I don't mind a simple one, but I'm afraid simple's too simple. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is.
I'm just going to say that my experience has been when you've done a simple survey, the public usually comes back and says, don't mess with it. I mean, we make assumptions that the research shows that kids need more.
That's great to hear.
But I just have the experience of a 35,000 student district, and they said, do you want us to study this? And when they started looking at it meant that disrupting, they said no, and it was 2 to 1.
Yeah.
No, don't touch the schedule. Just leave it disruption. So I guess I just wanna know, do they want us to look at it? And if it's overwhelmingly we do, then we will look at it and we will put together a plan. But that plan is gonna be pretty intensive, because we also have to look at the impact on employees and what happens with custodial. And now custodians now at a high school are gonna work until 11 or 12 at night instead, and and come in. It has a significant impact. We have to make sure every stakeholder is heard in that.
And that was my comment is, I'm all for this. There's going to be, my neighborhood is not going to fill out as many surveys. There's a ton of us in I have the geographically smallest district because we are packed in there, right? And we're also the ones that don't fill out the surveys, and I think that, and there's a variety of reasons for that we can have. If you wanna have a discussion with me, give me a call. But I don't think that means they shouldn't be represented. So as we do this, we need to figure out how are we going to hear their voices in this. If they're afraid to fill out the survey, or they don't want to fill out the survey, or whatever that is, that needs to be factored in, because it's my neighborhood that has the older siblings dropping off the kids.
Can I ask for clarification? Because this has been studied. We did get like a presentation when I first started on the board. Was that just specifically a small group, remind me, or was it like it wasn't a public survey, correct?
Correct. So what we've done twice since I've been on the board is that was one of my first assignments actually, was to sit on a committee. And it was probably 15 people, parents, teachers, board members, staff, like that, not a lot.
Yes, I just don't want to redo that.
And then we
did
that
this 5 years
right.
ago.
Right, and then we did it again. And so, and we, like I said, we came up with the same determination as like, it's too drastic of a disruption, whatever, we're just gonna chill and wait and watch other districts do it first and then see what happens, that kind of sentiment, but we really never have asked the public.
So yeah, it sounds like it may be useful just to say, what is the temperature, right?
Right.
Generally, not just the people who've reached out, but.
Okay, so we have 3 minutes to finish this. So have we determined that we want to give a directive to go ahead with a temperature survey? Just, do you want us to study this? Because that feels a lot simpler than maybe a grander survey with all of the information. Does everybody feel okay with that? And does the rest of the staff feel like we have capacity for that right now? Jason.
I think we have capacity. I go back to what Terry mentioned. We actually are just getting ready to send out the calendar survey to the public, and we send 2 of them about 4 weeks apart. And so we're going to be sending those out in the next couple of weeks, and we will start the other process, which will include getting the public's input. So I don't mean to say let's not do it. I'm just thinking maybe we ought to push it into spring, right? April?
Spring, does that make sense? Is like January too early? I guess we're still in strategic planning at the time.
I think January would be a good time to do it, and then we can start to formulate an action plan so that you're really using then all of next year to put together what that plan looks like with an implementation for.
What would that be, 25, 26? Is that the year it would be?
Right.
The following.
Because this is going to be a very involved process. And it's involved because even if you just say we're starting everybody just X amount of time later, it still is disrupting people's work and babysitters and daycare and all the things. So anyway.
So then is that the directive that we want this to happen in January? Does that sound good to everyone? And that's not gonna overlap too much with our strategic planning surveys, right?
That survey is gonna go out before
November.
Christmas. So
Okay.
yeah, November-ish.
So people will have forgotten about the other surveys by then, so we won't be
We'll just
overwhelming
highlight,
them.
we're really asking for input, we're really engaging.
Okay, all right, okay, that was productive, thank you, everybody. Let's go ahead. Yes, Bonnie?
Actually, so we're an hour early, which is never, I don't know, I should never say never, but.
It's our lucky day.
It's late, right? It's here, and it's gonna get cold, just a thought.
Okay, all right. You're the superintendent, and so we take your opinion with extra weight. So Wendy thinks we should adjourn for lunch. So I'm okay with starting lunch now and then continuing with our agenda after lunch. So we're gonna adjourn officially, right, until we come back? Right, we need to adjourn officially, correct? Before we start back up, right? Okay, all right. So then is there a motion to adjourn until we're done with lunch? And that, wait, actually, let me just take a look at this. We gave ourselves 25 minutes for lunch on our agenda. So that means we would need to reconvene at 12:15. So we'll adjourn until 12:15. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Motion made by Board Member Hall. We are adjourned until 12:15.
Do I have to say, okay. I don't think I have to say the full thing.
Didn't we say we had to say,
I move that we adjourn the
Yes.
study session.
Okay, that's all we need, right? Okay, we are adjourned until 12:15.